Technicians of Spaceship Earth, welcome to Hawkbinge, your guide to the astral plane that is the Hawkwind discography, one album at a time, in the company of a long-term fan, which would be me, and your favourite first-time listener, which is Matt in Berlin. Hey Matt, how you doing?
I am doing very well, thank you, Andy. It is the nicest day of the year to date. We've had that false spring, which is very famous. Things peak up quite nicely, and then it goes psych, and it drops back down to freezing again a week later, which I know it's going to do, but for this weekend, the sun has been out, the ice cream shops have been open, suddenly abandoned streets become full of deck chairs and people, so it's a reminder that the year will get better.
We passed a couple of milestones this week in my brain, which is that when you get up, you don't turn the light on. And if you go home at the normal time, which is incredibly rare, but if you do, then it's borderline light outside. And that feels like a turning point. So it's been quite nice.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, we have been listening to Distant Horizons for a long time. It doesn't feel like that because Alien 4 is our most recent show. And obviously, we actually put it up not that long ago. It's only about 3 weeks or so since we put Alien 4 up. But we recorded that months ago. Because it was a hugely long edit for you to do. Is it like an hour for each 10 minutes or something that you do, right?
I think my fastidiousness means it's about that.
Yeah.
So yeah, as soon as we have like a 3-hour show, I'm like, uh-oh, this will take a minute.
Well, exactly. And I think we had a lot more than that because, of course, we had the Joe segment on the end and we talked for quite a long time anyway. So I think you had more or less like a working week to do, and that took forever. And I suspect that the way our lives are, we're probably looking at 4 to 5 episodes a year, I would suggest, in our turnaround. But yeah, so this should be a fun one, because this is one that appeared that I didn't actually know was released. But before we get to Distant Horizons, I'm guessing you've heard a few other things in that time, Matt.
I have, and the first one is a return to one of the dance music styles that came up during my early explorations into Clubland, and that was just called breakbeat. Breakbeat, by its name, threw off that typical 4/4 kick, drum, techno and house rulebook, but instead it embraced this more disco and funk style, still using drum machines, but dropping the tempo a bit and adding a lot of swing and groove. And one of the artists that came up on this sound were the Plump DJs. British duo that took the funk of breakbeat but still kept the sound experimental and freaky with lots of weird samples, huge bass lines and cavernous kick drums. I saw them in room 1 of Fabric, one of the first times I ever went, and that night really stayed with me. It was a time when I basically discovered, fell in love with and got absolutely battered by this genre all in one night, and I knew it was immediately for me. A lot of the Plump DJ stuff was exclusively on vinyl for the longest time, but this year their label remastered a bunch of their early work and put it onto a double LP, which is now on Spotify. So I can put one of their more experimental but no less groovy tracks into the playlist, which is called Squeaks and Bleeps. And it's basically a collection of synth samples played in this sonic conga line over and over again while a massive drum loop keeps it all in time. And I do feel like if you listen to it with some of Hawkwind's more electronic experiments in mind, you can see maybe where I start to pique my interest into their work when they're dropping that kind of stuff. So in a way to bring Hawkwind devotees into my world a little bit, I present Squeaks and Bleeps Replumped by the Plump DJs on Finger Licking Records.
Sounds good. Sounds like one for a sunny day. Mine is also one for a sunny day, my first one, and a fairly recent one. It is by Luscious Jackson, who I got into quite a while ago, but after their peak, so I wasn't into them when they were current. Luscious Jackson are from New York for the most part, and they were around when the Beastie Boys were becoming big, and they were all part of the same New York village community. In fact, the drummer in Luscious Jackson was in the Beastie Boys before Beastie Boys transitioned into a hip-hop kind of a band, when they were in their hardcore era. But the band do something which is hard to describe, but one of the bands said that one of the most accurate descriptions of them by Journo was to describe them as lazy, bluesy hip-hop, which isn't a bad description, but they've got a lot of tunes, they've got a lot of samples, a lot of different instruments, and you kind of bounce as you walk. And things seem pretty okay with Luscious Jackson. And their debut album, Natural Ingredients from 1994, is the album that I listen to the most. It's on Grand Royal, which is the Beasties' own label, and it was the first release on that. And it's the opening track, City Song, which I've picked. It's a very positive, lovely mood, good vibe. unlike almost everything else I listen to, in fact. But a really nice departure and a good one for the Sessions playlist.
Have you found that the new springtime has started to inspire slightly happier music? Because I think for me, it certainly has.
Yeah, definitely. And I kind of went from Luscious Jackson to Beastie Boys and listened to a few of those old albums. And you just walk a little bit taller and bounce a little bit more as you're walking down the street. So yeah, it's been a good one to pick up.
My second one was one I just wanted to add because it's always nice to add some of the tracks which are defining to your musical awakening. And there are a few songs that I can say I know exactly where I was when I heard it first. But one of those is Has It Come to This by The Streets. I remember very vividly that I was in my room studying for my A-levels. I remember I was sitting on the floor with my work all around me and Radio 1 in the background, and I was half listening to it. And suddenly this came on, and I went from half listening to it to putting my pen down and just listening to the whole thing. It just grabbed me in such a strong way. You know, it's very hard to describe in a way why the track works. It's just one of those tracks that just does. The piano sample is an inspired find. It's so enigmatic, it loops so well, it feels kind of offbeat, but it's not. The quality of the vocals are weird but compelling. It's like they've been spoken across a highly compressed web chat program. Even with a high fidelity record pressing that I have, it still sounds slightly thin and far away, and I think that suits the piece so well. I actually read later in his memoir, Mike Skinner made almost the whole album in his flat with mattresses pressed around the walls for soundproofing, so the lo-fi feel is very real. And in fact, going into a studio for his subsequent albums only hurt his sound, but it's one of those things which you can't really replicate once you've done it. I think as well it was great to hear a new UK artist in the world of street music and rap, because it was dominated with US artists and grime hadn't quite showed up yet, so this album was more of a herald of things to come. And after all this time, I actually think my favourite track on that album is now Let's Push Things Forward, but Has It Come to This has to go into the playlist for the track that took the streets from total unknown to international star.
Is that the album with Dry Your Eyes Mate on it, or is that the next one?
No, that's the next one. No, this one is original Pirate material and just that really big tenement block in the front.
Got it. The Streets were popular playing material at work about the time that was current. It was on quite a lot. So yeah, that brings back some memories. My second one is less positive, but less negative than it could be. I was slightly surprised to discover that I hadn't yet put Necro Deathmort into the Sessions playlists. We'd avoided Necro Deathmort. We'd seen them on the bill for quite a long time at the various festivals we would go to, but they just sounded like a thrashy, death, screamy thing. And then I can't remember how I caught them, and it is anything but. It's instrumental, electronics, synths, some programming, a guy plays guitar. Sometimes they have a beat that turns their stuff into something that sounds kind of techno-ish, but quite often they don't. And I got heavily into them. They've been around for quite a long time. They've done a lot of albums and never really broken through. It's so far from being mainstream, but they are excellent. Necro Deathmort amuses me because it's a combination of three words that all mean death. So fun on that score. But their 2017 album, Overland, is probably the most accessible one of all of them. It's far less dense, much less menacing and dark. It has some beats behind it, but it's not techno. It's really easy to sink into and makes really good background when I'm on trains or I'm reading, things like that. So Overland from Profound Law Records is the label, 2017, and the track I'm putting on the playlist is the opening track called Polis. And definitely, if anyone's looking for an introduction to Necro Deathmort, it's a great place to start. So we've heard from some people and we've seen some interesting Hawkbinge discussion, haven't we?
A lot. So thanks to all the people who welcomed us back to publishing episodes, and thanks to everyone who pointed out that it had been 5 months since we last posted. Whoops. Alien 4 had a much more divided reaction than I feel we normally get to our episodes. But it was a good conversation and a lot of people sharing their thoughts, which was really interesting. Ian Stouffer said, when I first saw Ron fronting on the tour of the album, I thought he looked so thin and slightly uncomfortable, but he grew into the role and was a great injection into the band. Richard Hood, no relation I'm assuming, generally agreed with our assessment of the album, saying, I've always felt that Alan Sputnik's Stan is pitched too fast and would have benefited from being slowed down and perhaps elongated. I love Dave's guitar on this, particularly the midsection back to the final part. Uncle Ambient did not agree so much with our episode, saying Alien 4 is a great album. I think you guys are way too critical and analytical here. Just strap yourself in for the ride and have some fun. Harry Thompson was also not convinced with our verdict, saying, I can't really understand how you can dislike the first few tracks at all. They have so much energy. I found them a real return to form after It Is the Business of the Future to be Dangerous, and Ron's singing, while somewhat reminiscent of Calvert, has a character of its own. Angry Saints said, I also love the Ron Tree years. Not sure I see a Calvert connection from Ron, to be honest. I see it as more of a return to the old proto-punk sound, albeit updated to something more ominous, which I think we would agree with. I think the Calvert thing is something I would love to move away from. I don't think it's doing anyone any favours. And while it was interesting as a thought piece to explore then, I think trying to tar anyone with the Calvert brush is just massively unfair.
Yes, I would agree. I think it was valid to bring it up with the last record, given that Death Trap is on it. The words Bob Calvert are not words you will hear after this with relation to Distant Horizons.
Fair enough. Rick said, I'm not surprised that Matt doesn't care for Alien 4. That said, I think it's a good album that gets lost in a sea of very good albums. He then asked the question, how can you have 4 tracks in a row that you like and still despise the album? I think it's fairer for Matt to say the album is inconsistent. I think to that, I would say that for an album to be inconsistent, I would have to feel that the tracks I like and the tracks that I don't like balance out emotionally by the end of the album. I think for me, despite the tracks that I do like, I can't help but feel that emotionally, by the end of it, I'm left on a downer. And it is the feeling at the end of the album that I tend to use as a reflection of my opinion of the album. To put it another way, if I went to a restaurant that served a 15-course meal and 4 of the courses were good, I would not go back to that restaurant.
Yeah, that's fair. I think, though, that despise is a very strong word. My feeling about your response to the album was that there were 1 or 2 bits of it that you had strong negative reactions to. There was a lot of it that you were quite lukewarm about. And let's face it, albums that you're lukewarm about are not ones that are on repeat play in your household generally. And there were 1 or 2 that we were both able to get into on a fairly positive level. So you might tell me different now, but it didn't come across to me that you hated it, just that it didn't do an awful lot for you. And that the negative tracks that you felt fairly strongly about outweighed Vegas, Bundestan and festivals. So yeah, despises are stronger than I would have said your response to it was.
I would say the same. Again, I don't know if that's just playful hyperbole or whether or not that is what Rick thinks. I mean, critically, talking about it, Alien 4 is a good album because there's a lot to say.
Yeah.
Is it a good album to listen to? For me, no. But like you said, I like it when I don't like a track in a way because I can find things to talk about, you know? And I love when I find tracks that I love because I can find things to talk about. The worst thing is listening to a track and thinking, that's all right. Because where do you go from there?
Yeah.
I would say that Alien 4 is obviously nuanced and rich and interesting. However, on balance, as an album, would I listen to it again? Not so much. And I think that's the difference between the ways that you can listen to things. We are a critical podcast, and I think sometimes the word critical and critic can instantly sound bad, because criticism is seen as bad. However, critically acclaimed is a good thing. So I think we just need to remember that we're just 2 people who like talking about the music. We're not an authority on anything. We're just 2 people who happen to do this and have microphones. I love the discourse and it's interesting. I don't personally think that I despise it. I just think that I found a lot to explain why I didn't like it. And maybe that comes across as I'm picking, but all I'm trying to do is to be entertaining when we're talking about the album. So I hope I haven't made too many people mad, but also the way that these things work, we can put our thoughts out into the ether. It goes into other people's brains and mixes with all their life experiences and stuff. And you can never fully explain what you actually meant. But no, I wouldn't say despise. I would just say happy to move on from.
Well put. I mean, the beauty, I think, of all of these responses is that we're in a beautifully privileged position of being able to say that something didn't really connect or whatever without fearing some backlash. I think everybody comes to us in a spirit that what we've said is with respect and highly subjective. So we've never really had to endure massive criticism on that. I say we, it's generally more you than me. But I think that's part of the fun, because I think if you weren't able to do that, and you kind of had to love everything, then actually when you do love something, it wouldn't mean anything. And you do. So hopefully people aren't too annoyed when Matt doesn't like the things that he's supposed to. All of which tees up today quite nicely. But there was more, Matt.
Yes, David Dalrymple, I hope I'm saying that correctly, confirmed that Space Sex was indeed only on the double vinyl version when the album first came out on the Emergency Broadcast System label. He also said the vinyl version of Journey fades out a few seconds earlier than the CD version. The CD version has that big echoing chord right before the fade out, but on the vinyl mix, the song has already started fading at that point, so the chord is barely audible, which is interesting. Thanks very much for confirming, David. Appreciate that. Bart Simpson said, I always thought that 4 in Alien 4 is simply the 4 members of the band, which I honestly had not considered, but makes perfect sense. Michael Horton seemed to agree, saying, I think I read somewhere that it was named Alien 4 because the 4 band members were alienated from the mainstream music industry, which again, completely makes sense. A Crooked Beat added some crazy background to the festival's track, which sent me into a little rabbit hole of reading about the fall of the free festival scene. To put it very quickly, essentially the free festival scene was a lifeline for the UK travelling communities, and that it was all fine for a while, but a disaffected younger generation of travellers called the Brew Crew took against the free festivals and set about causing so much chaos that they couldn't continue. A Crooked Beat mentioned at a festival near Brighton, Dave was shot in the leg with an air gun, and their vehicle and dog was also attacked, which put an end to Hawkwind joining the festivals. So a crazy story and a sad ending to something the band clearly enjoyed and were a big part of. But I think that is the event that maybe inspired festivals. There's pages and pages online about this, but the politics and the prejudices and stuff behind the free festival scenes and how they were actually quite actively sabotaged because people didn't like them after a while is really interesting to read about.
Yeah, it was amazing that you kind of picked up on all of that from the lyrics and then found out retrospectively that actually your reading of that situation was pretty clear. And it just shows actually what a powerful track that is.
Absolutely. Bramwell Johnson said, this is where Matt and I have a difference of musical opinion, which is a very polite way of saying that I'm wrong. He says, I think Alien I Am is a humdinger of a track with disturbingly intriguing lyrics and a slide into a chorus that could be belted out. Sputnik Stan musically may be a decent rocker, but the lyrics are throwaway and remind me of some old 2000 AD Future Shock short comic strip. Maybe I just don't really enjoy Hawkwind's attempts to be humorous. And lastly, a few hellos. So hello to Peter Malteson. He said, I've been binging on these Hawkbinge podcasts over the last 3 weeks or so and have just arrived at Church of Hawkwind. As a fan since the late 70s, I'm really enjoying hearing the views of a Hawkwind newcomer, and it's making me go back and revisit some of the older albums I was never quite so keen on and hearing them with new ears. Looking forward to binging on your remaining Hawkbinges. Keep up the good work. I love that Mary Lattimore album, by the way, Tar for the Heads Up. So a new person who also listens to our Spotify output. So very, very good welcome to Peter.
That's great. And also what's been said there about revisiting old albums, that's something that means a lot to us when we hear that.
A hello to Tim Williams, who posted an APB hello from the Hawkwind and related album history podcast wall on Facebook to us and triggered some really nice comments from people who listen. So hi to all of you. Going through that was very heartening, especially after our long hiatus. The fact that people were welcoming us back was lovely. And finally, a hello to Duncan Storr of Live Chronicles artwork fame, who reached out to say that he listened to our comments about the album and the cover. Please reply back to us on Facebook. We'd love to continue that conversation.
All very good. Great to hear from everybody. So with all that in mind, let us go back to the 1990s, 1997 specifically. So we're a couple of years on from Alien 4 and see what the musical landscape of 1997 was. What has it evolved into? What is the world into which Distant Horizon makes its arrival? It is the year of Homework by Daft Punk, and also the year of Come My Fanatics by Electric Wizard. So it's already fairly diverse. David Bowie's Earthling comes out that year. That's his drum and bass album, if I'm not mistaken. Oblivion by The Orb, Ben Folds 5 make their debut. Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds, The Boatman's Call. 9 Lives by Aerosmith is in 1997. The huge Fat of the Land by Prodigy comes out this year and feels in my head like that changed everything. Queensryche, Here in the Now Frontier is that year. Chemical Brothers, Dig Your Own Hole, Marillion, The Strange Engine. Elegantly Wasted is Michael Hutchence' last In Excess album. There is Heavy Soul by Paul Weller, which I genuinely really loved and still do. Leonard Skinner come out with 20, which is 20 years since the plane crash disaster. So that's a monument for them. Melvin's Honky is out this year, and it is their 40th anniversary this year. Toad the Wet Sprocket, which I'm really saying just because I think it's a brilliant band name, come out with Coil. Foo Fighters, The Colour and the Shape, Faith No More album of the year, which I love. Wu-Tang Clan, Wu-Tang Forever is this year. $3 Bill, y'all, is the debut album of Limp Bizkit, God Help Us All. The Drop by Brian Eno, Echo and the Bunnymen reform and put out Evergreen this year. Teenage Fan Club, Songs from Northern Britain. A really interesting album that I need to seek out and listen to is Spinner by Brian Eno and Jar Wobble. That's a really interesting little partnership there. I need to check that out. Biohazard have No Holds Barred. Oasis, Be Here Now. Calling All Stations by Genesis, which is their singular attempt at doing an album without Phil Collins that rather nosedived. Portishead come out with their second album called Portishead. The Verve Urban Hymns, which again was on constant rotation in the office where I worked, and I really hated it. LL Cool J, Phenomenon, is out that year. Salt and Pepper, brand new. Mogwai, Young Team. I know you're a fan of Mogwai, Matt. Metallica Reload, kind of in their period of albums that not everybody loves. All Saints have their debut called All Saints. Yes have an album called Open Your Eyes, which I'd never even heard of. I had no idea Yes released that album. Black Grape, Stupid, Stupid, Stupid. And Will Smith releases Big Willie Style, which I remember because it had some tunes that were on constant rotation. Those are the big albums. The 5 biggest singles of the year are Candle in the Wind by Elton John, which is his reworking of it for Princess Diana, called Goodbye English Rose. And I really hated that. I think Candle in the Wind is genius, but I hated the reworking. Puff Daddy and Faith Evans, I'll Be Missing You. Aqua, Barbie Girl, No Doubt, Don't Speak, and Hanson Umbop. So it's pretty clear that people are buying some pretty appalling music in 1997 and in some huge quantities. So that is the year of 1997. What are Hawkwind doing? Well, the big news is Alan Davey has left the band. He was the bass player, and what an amazing bass player he was. Ron Tree, who had come in about halfway through Alien 4, if you remember, he talked about doing Hawkwind karaoke and kind of adding his vocals to stuff that had been recorded. Well, he's in from the start, he's in the band, and he takes over the bass duties from Alan. Big shoes to fill, but he was a bass player before becoming a singer. Richard Chadwick, of course, is in the band. Dave Brock, of course, is in the band. And Jerry Richards, who contributed guitar to some tracks on Alien 4, and again seems to have come in kind of at the end of that process. He is in from the start, and seems to me that he is all over this album, and I think that's something that we will get to. On tour, they had a couple of people joining them. Captain Riz, who is described on Wikipedia as a Rastafarian toaster. Now, not being in the toasting fraternity, that made me smile for obviously pathetic reasons. And Julian Crumb Crimmins, neither of whom are on the album. They were around the band at the time. It's recorded at Earth Studios in Devon and produced by Hawkwind. It's released in November of 1997 on Emergency Broadcast Systems. There was an Atom Henge double vinyl re-release that has bonus tracks on it, and we will get to that later on. That is a strong conversation point. It failed to chart, and it's fair to say that the reception for Distant Horizons is fairly damp by any standards. There is almost nothing written about it in Carol Clark's mighty epic tome, The Saga of Hawkwind. She covers the period a lot, because it's a very rich period in Hawkwind history, with various people falling out and issues with management and lots of things going on. We are not a Hawkwind history podcast. We are a Hawkwind music podcast. So if that history stuff and who's falling out with who and why and what they do and what they say about each other, if that's your jam, the books by Carol Clark, Saga of Hawkwind, by Ian Abrams, Sonic Assassins, it's written about beautifully by brilliant authors, and I urge anyone to seek it out if you want all of the backstory and context. We're really just about the music. Carol Clark doesn't put an awful lot in about this particular album, which tells you a lot. But what she does say is, The 1997 autumn tour was timed to promote the release of Distant Horizons, which had been recorded earlier that year. And in line with Alan Davies' opinion of the album, few of the band were happy with it. Obviously tells you what Alan thought of it. Dave Brock says the keyboards were the weird, spacey, dancey things. Some of those things didn't work. It sounded a bit wishy-washy, but you have to try. Jerry Richards comments, the album was constantly being interrupted by having to go off and do gigs. It was unbelievably distracting. I really liked doing gigs, but the band were contractually obliged to deliver something and being stretched in a million different directions into all kinds of strange shapes when the management structure isn't all that. It's very difficult to keep things running smoothly. It was a very difficult album to make. I like bits and pieces of it. We didn't have as much editorial control over it as we should have had. What was released was not actually what was prepared. The rest of the band were fairly hacked off about it. So that is in Carol's book, and already you're starting to get a flavour here of the album not being particularly well received by the band themselves. There is a fantastic edition of Record Collector magazine, which focuses entirely on Hawkwind, and it's wonderful, and I would suggest everybody gets it. Ian Abraham actually has an awful lot to write in here. There are big full-page articles written about a lot of the album, so it's lovely to see those. White Zone, Alien 4 and Distant Horizons get one page between them, which again is rather telling. And Alison Rayman, I might be butchering that. It's Reijman, so it might be Ryman, Rageman, not sure. So apologies, Alison. She writes a couple of paragraphs about the album, kind of little one-sentence notes about the tracks, which are less than stellar. There was no overall plan or structure, she writes, just a patchwork of offcuts that loosely follow Hawkwind's previous techno path. This was glaringly evident on the title track, which featured some random rapping over a vaporous cloud of sub-Steve Hillage-like guitar. Phetamine Street is a lo-fi rattler. We've got Alchemy recalling some of Hawkwind's earlier days, but minus that magic spark. Dave Brock's plaintive voice on Clouded Visions makes for a sweeter interlude before the punkish onslaught of Reptoid Vision, which revisits Tree's beloved alien territory. But it does end up saying, the oft-recorded Love in Space re-emerges as an instrumental, bringing this whole odd saga to a merciful end. So you get the idea that this is not having an awful lot of lovely things said about it. Ian Abraham's Sonic Assassins actually does have a number of pages that talk about this record, and there are some of it that we'll come back to a little bit later on. But to start off with, we have Jerry Richards saying, I both enjoyed and endured the process of making that album. It was made not under the best conditions. So again, coming back to some interruptions for gigs and some kind of meddling by the record labels and things like this. He says there was an element of technical nonsense that got in the way of what we'd imagined the album was going to be. I don't think that was necessarily down to the band or the mastering plant or the record company. It was just a lot of copies and crossovers and things that went astray. And once the damn thing is out there, the cat is out of the bag, and that's it. Dave is kind of down on the album. So, Matt, not many kind words out there. Is that going to change?
Well, for a start, I'm glad I have the time privilege that I can go straight from Alien 4 to Distant Horizons without waiting for the 2 years it took to show up in stores. So that's very nice as someone who's looking back on it from 2025. It's interesting for me because this is the real start of my real independent musical awakening. Up until then, technically, I'd been rather reliant on my parents' record collections and their musical systems to play them on, as I think, most kids are. But I turned 13 in 97, and for my 13th birthday, my parents brought me my own hi-fi system with a CD player, and my brothers bought me Prodigy Fat of the Land. So it was the first CD I ever bought. I remember listening to that on this hi-fi system that I was allowed to have in my room, and I think I just played it, again and again and again. It was such an amazing, monumental album, and for me, that really started my love of finding my own music that would make me feel like me. And I wonder if 13-year-old me, if he had bought this album, what he would have thought of it. I think that he may have found some interesting parts in it. I think there's probably more rockiness than he would have appreciated because that wasn't his thing at that point. But I think it could have worked. It probably wouldn't have been the favourite album ever, but I think it would have been played a few times. For me, being a lot older now and listening in 2025, this album's been way more fun to listen and get into than Alien 4, for me at least. A bit like many of the other albums in the 90s that Hawkwind have made, this one has far less of an overall concept and also doesn't have any real think pieces that I enjoy from the band. But they have been sacrificed on the altar of generally good production, and things are fun to listen to, if not maybe as deep as maybe they have been. Considering how much I wasn't into the concept of Alien 4, I was very up for a straight down the line Hawkwind album full of jams, ambient interludes and electro rock collisions, and I would say that this album provides that. Just to brag for a second, you and I have been providing some content for a new Hawkwind book which will be coming out at some point in the future, and in doing so I was asked what my current Hawkwind Desert Island disc is, and to do so I went back and listened to a bunch of old stuff and went back through the entire playlist picks, and it is quite amazing how the sound from the 70s up till now has really changed and how authentically 90s a lot of this feels. Not Barbie Girl authentic, much more Orbital authentic, much more Chemical Brothers Dig Your Own Hole authentic. We're much more in that sphere of the underground 90s, the experimental synthy 90s, so it feels like where it belongs, which is nice, and I like that. While it's not a theme as such, I feel like this album is wearing a lot of influences from some of the leading electronic albums of the 90s, most notably Leftism by Leftfield, which came out 2 years before this album dropped, but would have been around the time when they might have been listening to it and could have got inspired by it. And while I don't have any hard evidence that this is the case, there are some fresh elements in this album that were popularized by that album. And, fair enough. It's still seen as one of the most influential electronic albums ever made. So if that is true, I don't know, but for me it stands to reason that they could have heard it and been inspired. Also, some of the people who they're playing with now, if they're playing with Jamaican Toasters, that kind of like Afro house, there's an embracement of that musical culture that's been in the UK for a while. So all of this is coming to a peak, and Hawkwind feel like the kind of band that would enjoy that and rush to embrace it. And maybe that's why I vibe with this album more than most of the other 90s albums, because more of what was impacting me at the time can definitely be heard through all of this. So I feel like this, for me, has actually been a pretty pleasant experience to go through. Like I said, nothing as deep as they've ever done, but a lot of the tracks feel like good examples of Hawkwind doing what Hawkwind can do. There is some rocky stuff, there is some ambient stuff, but it feels like it's less of an argument compared to last time. It feels this time that everyone's at peace with what they're making, and they seem to be luxuriating in the width of work that they can produce.
Yes, it might sound like that. I don't necessarily think they were, because it does sound like a very troubled time of recording rather than something where they're all in the studio at the same time and getting on with it. I'm so far in my Wilderness Hawkwind years that I was unaware this album came out. I did have, you might remember, a forerunner of Napster was Audio Galaxy. And I remember in the early 2000s, a track came up on Audio Galaxy for me called Alchemy with the Distant Horizons cover. And I looked at it and I thought, I don't know that. I don't recognize it. So I dismissed it. And it was only years later that I even realized that Distant Horizons was an actual Hawkwind album, because there's so many Hawkwind releases. And it was like, oh, that's a studio album. And then a few years later, when I got back into Hawkwind fully again, I then thought there's Hawkwind studio albums out there I haven't even heard. But I didn't really buy it because I was excited to hear it. I bought it because it was a Hawkwind album I didn't have. So this is, 10 or 12 years ago, probably about the time that the Atomhenge double vinyl reissue came out, which is what I've got, on a kind of a marbled grey vinyl, which is kind of cool. And I think it arrived, and I played it that evening, didn't massively connect with it, wasn't really expecting to, so I got out of it what I put into it, if you know what I mean. I gave it a play because you should, and then I put it in the record collection and never played it again. And coming back round to it, we had recorded Alien 4, and immediately after we recorded Alien 4, I had to do a lot of work travel in a very short space of time. Found myself in New York with a couple of hours to kill before the next thing I had to do. I was just going to go walking around, and I thought, well, what shall I listen to? And then it just kind of struck me, well, we've done Alien 4. We are about to do this one. Okay, well, there's no time like the present. I put the headphones on, walked out of the hotel and just kind of wandered around and was incredibly surprised. Although it took me a few minutes to be surprised, because track 1 was exactly what I thought track 1 would be. And to be honest, what I was hoping it wouldn't be. It's not been easy recording the last few episodes. There's plenty to like. But if you're taking albums you're not really massively connecting with on a deep level, and you're listening to them 30 odd times, it can be quite a slog. And then desperately trying to find up moments and things to zone in on, find things that can open up the rest of the album for you. But you're having to do quite a lot of gymnastics to get there. And given the rate that we record at, those 3 albums after Space Bandits, that's probably the better part of a year's worth of listening for us. And so I was kind of expecting that. And then obviously that's not what I got. And I think it was such a jumping off from where I thought we were to where we went to, that my first listen to the album was very, very positive. You know, it has its up and down moments. But on the whole, I was very happy that I was going to be listening to this album for the next few months. So, yeah, it's going to be a really interesting little journey. And why don't you kick us off, Matt, with the title track that opens the record?
Yes, Distant Horizons, the Distant Horizons mix.
Yeah, there's an EP that comes out before this that has 1 or 2 of these tracks on it. That's why.
Oh, well, that's great to know. And also good to know that it's there for a reason and not just because that's how some tracks talk about each other. Distant Horizons also one of the few times when the name of the track is A, on the album, and B, the first track on the album. And we know that we've had some of these before, which I have liked and some which I haven't liked. And I will say this track isn't bad. For me, it's a good opening statement from a band that's clearly been fighting within itself to work out which decision to commit to for a few albums now. It's a title track that's worthy of its title, so that's a good start, I think. It's not what I was expecting either. Clearly, it keeps some of the learnings from some of the other albums, but it does do it in slightly different ways. I like that we open on this hissy, distorted, barely audible snatch of what sounds like a TV or radio broadcast. It's thin and crackly, just on the edge of perception. I think it says "This must be space," which is a fun sample given the band's genre of choice. If you compare it to the Alien 4 intro, which is a whole track, which I was not really sure about, I do like the fact that this is lighter, more playful in tone, already makes me feel like Hawkwind are going to have a bit more fun, perhaps, and I think on the whole that they do. Because what comes to take over from that nano intro is a full suite of electronics. We have this deep, modulated bass tone with a minimal loop, almost dance music feel to it. There's another synth blip in the mid register adding this complementary accent to the loop, and there's this pared back rhythm section with a lot of jangly shakers and hats all in the upper register, and everything sounds crisp and clear. Everything's in its own sonic area of the mix. I think it's a confident and adroit start to an album, which immediately makes me feel very confident about it, because when they are confident in their production, I immediately settle back more as a listener and start to enjoy it more, rather than feeling like you said that you have to put a lot of yourself into the listening. If you can just sit back and let it come to you, it's just way more relaxing, so you just naturally enjoy it more. I can't tell if the drum kit is fully synthetic or partially synthetic or what, but there are some ratchets thrown into the drums that sound like a modern trap beat to add interest, which I think must have been sequenced. So it's possible this intro is entirely digital, which is immediately different from the vibe of the previous albums. Obviously not something they've never done before, but as an opener, they haven't done it in a long while. It's a really nice interplay of things. So on the whole, it's very cool. It sounds quite electronic. It's already got quite a lot of dance music learnings in it. It's got the loops, it's got the percussion, it's got these little ratchets and fills and things. And then this MC style vocal blasts in, all big energy and strong Jamaican accents, spitting a kind of East London scat over the track, which immediately reminded me of Afro Left by Leftfield. So that's the first time I feel the influence is there within the first minute of the album. And again, whether or not it is because of that or whether or not they just had someone or found this thing and went, yeah, that's a good thing to add, it's very of the time for me. It's very mid-90s UK, it captures that really nicely. And as the emceeing rolls on the track, we're slowly building things underneath it. We're building this mid-range synth that's adding more notes to this plucky pattern. The filters being relaxed on the bass to let more timbre and texture through. So we're building up the bass end. The drums are starting to sound a bit more organic. We've got ride cymbals and faded snares, adding fills throughout. So we're getting this very slow boil that languidly builds in intensity while this MC is pushing us forward with this rabid attack. And one thing that's interesting for me in this section is that you could totally drop a big 4/4 kick drum onto this and it would immediately become a 90s electro dance record, which I'm sure they're aware of, but they choose not to do that. They're not wanting to fully commit to a big electro festival sound like Left Field. They're more happy to go and, like raid the pantry for cool elements that they can use to spice up their sound, which I respect a lot because I think it's the right thing for them to do. And given their White Zone album wasn't that long ago, I felt like they could have given it a try to see where it might take them, but they still want to keep themselves more of a band and of a rocky persuasion. So I think this was part of their mission statement that they're not going to do that, but they are still going to grow and explore what contemporary electronics can sound like, but they're not going to fall into the trap of suddenly trying to become a Chemical Brothers. In fact, this notion that they might do it is removed from my head after this smooth padded breakdown, and then the track totally switches up to essentially almost like a different track. We have this shouted female vocal which I cannot decipher, which then triggers a huge switch up in the sound. Again, to reference Left Field, they do this in the track Release the Pressure, where they have this very chilled reflective intro for 2 minutes before dropping into a fully blown track. And in the Hawkwind track, it's like the opposite is true. All the rocker elements of the space rock recipe comes storming in to drive the track in this dramatic new direction. And I don't mind what it does. I just wish that it maybe had been done with a little bit more care or subtlety. I feel like the person behind the studio mixing desk suddenly realized there was a whole bunch of people playing that they couldn't hear and just threw all the faders up. There's not a fill, there's not a build. It very much just crashes in, which with repeat listens I've got used to. And once you get over that, the band make up for lost time with these really big soaring guitar noodles, these fast-paced bass pluckings, and the synth pad floats between all the elements like an expert waiter through a crowded restaurant. And then as fast as it all arrives, it departs with this other sample, this time of what sounds like a police helicopter telling a crowd to disperse. So I think there's a bit of Hawkwind anti-authority stuck in at the end there. So yeah, I think on the whole, it's a good start to the album. I think ignoring the musical lurch in the middle, it's arranged well, it's a good length, it's got a good quality sound to it. It's different to what's come before, but still sounds very them. I think if a first track should be a mission statement for the album, which I personally believe first tracks should be, then I think whilst this isn't as rocky and punky as this album can get, by adding the space rock in the second half, it does feel like they're leading with this electronic intro, but they're saying, but watch out, there's more to this than maybe meets the ear.
Yeah, well said. You found a huge amount to talk about in this track. It's definitely a track of two halves for me. And the first half of the track was a bit of a struggle for me, I have to admit. Probably defines the two endpoints of our mutual musical journeys, if you like. And I felt, we're back in It Is the Business of the Future to Be Dangerous territory again. And then when the female vocal kicks in and that splash of guitar happens, that kicked me out of that. And I suddenly thought, no, this is going to go somewhere different. And I'm now interested in where this is going to take us. I think if the rest of the track had been like the first half, then it wouldn't have set me up in a very positive frame of mind for what the rest of the album had, because I didn't connect particularly with those kind of rapped vocals. I could totally get what you're saying about it being of the time. I guess it was of the time from a musical subculture that I had no idea existed. And I really enjoy the second half of it and sets me up for what the rest of the album is going to deliver. Perhaps in an inaccurate way, because the rest of the album has some very random turns. But I quite like that. And we'll come back to that actually in some of the things that Ian says about it when we wrap up. But we get to Phetamine Street, which is track 2. It's written by Ron Tree, who had said that he wanted to bring like a harder edge to what happens. And he certainly does. Phetamine Street, Matt.
This is the first Hawkwind track ever that no website has the lyrics for. Because I was listening to them and they're quite muddy. And I do like checking because, as we've seen before, like the little ones that are so blissful is something which I never would have got otherwise. So I do like to try and find an authority on the lyrics. And there's no inner sheet, as far as I can tell, that has the lyrics. No one has put onto any of the lyric websites what they are. There was that one track a few albums ago where at least someone had tried and just put question marks in the lyrics where they weren't sure where they were. But this one, the lyrical cupboard is bare. It's funny because when I did a search through Google and wrote Phetamine Street, it said, did you mean Amphetamine Street? Which for me answered a few of my suspicions immediately. But it was the only bit of information I was going to get. And as you said, it was credited to Ron Tree. So he's clearly more active in the creation of this album than last time when he complained he was basically doing a kind of karaoke over the completed tracks. So to turn our attention to the track itself, I said that Distant Horizon ends with the police helicopter, but actually it ends with what sounds like a bunch of tropical birds that carry over onto the start of Phetamine Street, which works as a nice little palette cleanser between the two because from an energy, from a genre point of view, they're very, very different. We begin with this lengthy pulse in a synth that comes under the birds for a moment, and then the band strike up and it feels like this album's going to go into a bit more of a traditional space rock direction, maybe defying the expectations that we got from the previous track. We then have some definitely real drums this time and some very raw, twangy bass. You can almost feel the heavy gauge strings vibrating next to the microphone. They sound so close, which I really like. I think that sounds very visceral. So it does feel like we're going in a more punky, textural delivery in this track over anything quote unquote musical and melodic. And the music they are playing is very basic in a way. You know, I can say that because it's the same 3 chords that I used when I did my Sonic Attack cover in New York almost 3 years ago. And I know how basic my production is. It means then that you pay more attention to how it's played rather than what it's playing. So you get to appreciate that raw sound. And, you know, the fuzz guitar, the twangy bass and the thwacky drums are so up close and personal that it becomes very hard to hear these lyrics when they do come in. I get snatched words. I get phentamine, almost what sounds like then methadream, which is not a word, but it's what I hear. I'm pretty sure I hear ketamine, which is an actual drug. Yeah, I hear monochrome, future zone, on your own. And then we get things like in your dreams, in your head, phentamine dream, vitamin C, when you're walking down the street, I see your face, TV vision in your eyes, and some other stuff. But it's safe to say that it's a slowly building list of statements that seem to be about or are referring to a kind of Skid Row type area, either a real experience or a fictitious or archetypal place. And knowing the kinds of places Hawkwind tend to find their band members, I wouldn't be surprised if this was a real story from Ron Tree about a place he grew up or lived in at some point in his life. The fact that it's called Phentamine Street makes it feel like it's an analogy or like a pseudonym for a real place, and the lyrics themselves seem to be hinting at a street where people have dulled their senses into a monochrome existence through drugs. And, you know, books like Trainspotting came out in the early 90s about urban drug use destroying whole areas of cities, especially in Scotland. I know that was mainly heroin, but I'm sure that that can be related to all sorts of drug use. So I do feel like the content of this story is probably quite relevant in the time. The lyrics are sparse but vivid enough to conjure up a few interesting mental images. Not maybe as many as something like High Rise of albums past, but it does an interesting job. The lyric that stands out to me is the single shouted vitamin C, which when I first heard the line I thought it was just a random thing to shout, but actually I did a little research and it informs me that vitamin C is very common in drug rehabilitation practices as it helps with withdrawal symptoms. It feels almost like a drug use deep cut line that adds legitimacy to this as a real experience. That's got that nice feeling that Hawkwind can do with just one shouted lyric can help deepen that experience. And the music around the lyrics remains quite basic and punky throughout the track's almost 6 minutes of runtime. It's all rough around the edges and close up to you, and it feels very live, more punky than Hawkwind usually are, more punky than the 90s even usually gets. This sort of music feels like it's now a few years in the past from a pop point of view. Despite being one of the progenitors of punk in the 80s, they're only just getting into it themselves, you know, a decade later. But maybe they're just trying to keep it alive. Maybe they like it. Maybe, you know, Ron Tree's a devotee and the band were into it. I'm not sure. I feel like the track is almost punk rock in its arrangement until about 2/3 of the way through, when this long synth pad comes in to add a slightly scorched layer of spaciness to it. So overall, I think it's a very organic and very lively piece that I've actually come to enjoy as an immediate counterpoint to Distant Horizons, the memory of an idea, of an experience that someone had.
I love this track with some caveats. So as you say, as the follow-on from Distant Horizons, it's perfect sequencing. The presence of this track after Distant Horizons does prepare you for the fact that you have no idea what the subsequent tracks are going to be like. And it does it with an energy and a power that feels like a splash of ice water on the face. I kept comparing this to Queens of the Stone Age Feel Good Hit of the Summer, but actually they're not the same. And actually, Feel Good Hit of the Summer is much more one-dimensional than Amphetamine Street. I don't think it's as good as Ron's other punkish track that comes later, but its placing is perfect. What I do love about this track, and what I've found on all of my repeat listens, is what the guitar is doing. Because most of the track is very driving, the bass is very much chugging along with the very powerful drums, which I really like. And it would be very easy for the guitar to just chug along with the bass and double the bass in a Sex Pistols kind of way. But actually, the guitar is moving all around that chugging bass line in a way that I really, really like. And whenever I listen to the track, I'm really listening to the guitar lines a lot of the time. So really interesting one. I also looked up the lyrics to several of these tracks and realized that just nobody's done the lyrics for Distant Horizons, which again gives you that impression that it's the one that passed everybody by and nobody talks about. You've talked about Dave's Hawaiian references. Apparently he, and I imagine Chris, had a beautiful Hawaiian holiday, which they've referred to several times since musically. And this is one with Waimea Canyon Drive, which is a Dave Brock tune.
The band made a good call by having the last 20 seconds of Amphetamine Street being some peaceful beach waves, because otherwise I think this track was not going to follow on well from it, but the waves simmer us down mentally so we can take in the much more chilled, soft drum beats and rather 80s bass organ and lead guitar that come in right away to kick this track off. I will say that I really hate the start of this track, and it's not the track's fault because it didn't know what was going to happen 3 decades after its creation, but 30 seconds into this track, they have these loud pitched cymbals to add interest to the groove, and the pitch and the rhythm and the sound of those cymbals is almost exactly the same sound my headphones make when they're low on battery. And I forget that they're on this track every time, and every time I hear them, I have this Pavlovian rage response because I know that my headphones are charged, and it's so loud and they come in so arbitrarily that they don't seem to fit with the groove that it sounds like an alert, and it's maddening. Even when I'm listening to it on my speakers, which clearly are already powered, and I hear it, I have this response that, like, I have to suddenly try and check a battery indicator. So not its fault, but I do have to try and work through that, and I forget every single time, and every single time it gets me. But after the annoying low power death cymbals, the track finishes its intro and starts to properly get going, and what we find ourselves in is this pretty laid back groovy number with elements of subtle psych and spaciness sort of sprinkled over the top. It's this 90s motorway city-esque vibe that completes the band's tonal trifecta of new age dub electro on track 1, punky space rock in track 2, and now very vibey synth jam on track 3. I do think it's quite 80s in its overall tonal feel. The drum kit has a very 80s snare, and the low chugging offbeat bass line feels quite old school synth pop, but I don't mind it. But when this track gets going and the whole thing really takes flight, we have this nice feeling of slow, meandering progress, like a river through a mountain gorge, you know, windy, but clearly on its way to take us somewhere. But it's in no rush to do so, and you can just lock in and vibe along. There's lots of delay effects on everything, which gives the whole piece this very trippy feel and creates a slowly building audio bed that we can wade around in as we listen. And then we get these faded vocals over the top, which start to repeat the name of the track. And this brings me to a small point of confusion, because Waimea Canyon is a place in Hawaii, but it's not spelt how the band have it on the album, which seems like a very strange error to have made. I've checked, and it's never been spelt like that and been changed. They've written it incorrectly. And considering as it's a place, I cannot get my head around why. I can't even imagine it's for like copyright reasons or something, because you can't really copyright a canyon. But yeah, so anyway, that always confuses me. But I'm almost certain they're referring to this place, because if you listen to the track and look at a photo of the actual area, they totally go together. And you can imagine a drive through Waimea Canyon being very chill and groovy. But to add the extra I in the name is perplexing. The midpoint breakdown is very ethereal and floaty, and there are more lyrics here which I feel like they might be making some kind of point, but they're too faded and filtered to make out again, and I had no luck sourcing the lyrics online. So the idea behind this track will likely remain forever a mystery. There's something about something you have to do or are going to do, I think, and something maybe turns against you, but that's all I've been able to get after a bunch of listens, and eventually I just kind of gave up and just went, oh, there are some vocals in there, that's nice. Yeah, overall, I like it. It's a pretty simple in its construction, but it's well made. It's got deep audio character to it, with all the elements gelling nicely to make this very pleasing whole. The very ending is a little disappointing as it suddenly flips to a single jittery synth chord, which we've not heard up until this point, which I always hate when they just bring in an element at the very end, because I feel like, why not just have that a bit at the beginning to usher us into the end? But we dissolve into this multitude of hazy effects, which is fine, but I feel like the track dissipates rather than ends, which is a bit of a shame, but I think the rest of the track is very nice, and given the track we're about to get, I guess it makes sense that they had to close this out in some definitive way, but I think they could have maybe worked more with it. Maybe contractual obligations or different studio times, as you said, meant that they never really were able to pen a satisfying conclusion to it.
Yeah, I agree with all that. It's another good, as you say, counterpoint to Amphetamine Street. When the vocals start up, I spent my first listen to this waiting for it to go somewhere, and of course it doesn't. Once I realised it wasn't going to, I was able to enjoy the fact that it didn't, because I kind of understood it for what it was. And one thing I do like in this track is the sound of Dave's voice. Either it's double tracked or he's singing his own harmony parts or whatever it is. But it's a nice sound because I like the sound of Dave's voice generally. And actually on quite a lot of the Hawkwind albums that we've covered over the past few episodes, I kind of want to hear more of Dave's voice. And in this, it's got a nice rhythm to the vocals. That Waimea Canyon Drive has a nice rhythm to it. And they've got a nice little melody to sing that to, and it propels things quite nicely. And in that repetitive way, it reminded me of Church of Hawkwind a little bit. It didn't remind me of any specific track from Church of Hawkwind. I can't say it's like that one, but just in mood, it kind of reminded me a little bit of Church of Hawkwind and them doing something that felt a little experimental in that way. And I enjoyed it. So yeah, now when it comes on, I can kind of sink into it nicely, and it totally doesn't prepare me for some actual Hawkwind heavy metal.
Yeah, this is Hawkwind in full Desert Fest mode. It's a sort of mix between underground stoner rock and more classic hard rock, for sure. It's less reliant on chords to be, I'd say, full metal. Instead, it's built around a more complex riff, which gives you a more Sabbathy, Caius-y feel, but the speed is too fast for doom or sludge, so you get a kind of speed Sabbath feel. It's also the first fully instrumental track on the album, really, but the guitar's doing a real spirited job of proving you don't need lyrics in order to rock out with this kind of stuff. To prove this, we open with a soloed electric guitar that takes us through the riff before the rhythm and bass guitars come to join the party. And I must say, when the track fully drops and the drums kick in, I wish it was heavier overall. The drums are lacking a really satisfying thump to get your head nodding. It's not terrible what they've done, but pulling that bass drum through more would have helped given more to work with as a listener. I would have enjoyed that real drop, but it's still nice as what it is. And at this point, people might argue with me that there are no vocals in the track. So maybe I should say that there are no lyrics in this track, because there's an indistinct voice swirling around what little space is left between all the guitars, but it's not really saying anything specific. It sounds more like a hazy, atmospheric incantation to continue the desert feel over anything we have to take in and understand. So I would still say that I'm right, even if I have to be a real pedant in order to do it. After about a minute of desertness, we turn up the drum intensity from half speed to full speed, and then we have this more metally feeling, like you said, to bring this track up to full speed and bring in a few more band staple spacey elements as well. This bit is not the most interesting bit for me, as I'm not a big classic metal fan, but when the lead guitar comes back to wail over the top, I do find myself getting back into it, and we resolve back into the speed riff, so the metally bit was more of a short B section transitioning us into the speed and intensity, which works well for what we had before. Then we have some cool fills we had in the beginning, where the lead and the bass guitars play the same notes as the drums hit at the same time, which is very cool, has this great unifying feel, and then like the whole band split off again after the fill, but this time they all start going into their respective closing sequences, with everything going into long sustained drones that slowly break up and fade into this cosmic ether. So yeah, it's short but sweet, sounds good. I would love to have heard this live at some point in the times that we saw them. I think this could have been a lot of fun live. I think it's nicely accomplished. Again, very, very different. It's still showing the tasting menu of everything that Hawkwind can deliver. But I think on the whole, I enjoy it.
Yeah, absolutely. The beginning of this, that guitar intro, sounds very Iron Maiden to me. The song doesn't, but that intro bit does, and when they come back to it. I assume that this is Jerry Richards. This track is credited to Jerry Richards and Richard Chadwick, the drummer. The guitar has a very 90s metal tone that Hawkwind guitarists have never had. It's the kind of thing, one of Black Sabbath's slightly softer albums, I suppose, which is a strange phrase to use, which is actually an 80s album, Heaven and Hell. Tony Iommi's guitar has this kind of tone to it. It reminds me a little bit of Ariok. Do you remember that? I prefer this to Ariok, and I really like Ariok, so I have to really like this. I think it fits very well in the album. It's one of those tracks, though, that you could imagine this track being a B-side or a bonus track. And if it was, you'd think, what a brilliant bonus track that is. Mm-hmm. But it's on that line between being what would be a brilliant bonus track and being a track that's actually like featured on the album. So I'm slightly conflicted. I do like it, but it's in that mode. And this is one of only 2 track credits that Jerry Richards gets. But I said at the beginning that it feels to me that Jerry Richards is all over this album. And maybe that is in terms of production or guitar tone, because there's a lot of guitar stuff on here that feels like it must be Jerry Richards simply because it doesn't sound like what Dave has done before. And Richard Chadwick actually says that to dismiss Jerry's involvement as being kind of meager in a way, in terms of only having credits on the 2 tracks, is not to appreciate the commitment that Richards made to Hawkwind during a period of immense practical and emotional difficulty for the band. So Richard says his amazing contributions to Hawkwind were in just keeping us going, or we would have collapsed, because Jerry has this fantastic capacity for work. He'll stick at something when other people would have given up. He spent many hours frantically programming stuff for Distant Horizon, staying up all night, getting things together. So it strikes me that Jerry Richards is heavily involved in the track beyond just the credits he gets. And the guitar tone for me stands out as almost a signature of this album as a whole. We haven't heard it before, and we don't really hear it again. So it's an interesting one for me, this. And this rounds out side 1 of the vinyl, which has made for a pretty eclectic and interesting set of 4 tracks for side 1. And when we flip the record over, we get Dave Brock's Clouded Vision.
So I find at this stage of the album, the pace starts to falter a bit. I think we've had a lot of imagination, a lot of energy, a lot of variety. And for me now, one of the wheels on our cart is starting to wobble a little bit because we switch into wistful ballad mode, which is keeping us on our toes. But this always feels like a pace killer. It's okay, but after everything that's come before, it feels a bit misplaced. And it suffers from some of the things that Hawkwind do that I'm not a fan of, and that may be my personal reaction. But for me, the lyrics are not super engaging, and there's a word-to-line issue a few times in the delivery, which I always don't appreciate when it happens. And the overall production sounds rather muted compared to the intensity of the previous tracks as well. So I feel like we've lost quite a few of the things which I was enjoying this album for. Even though we're doing it through multiple genres, there was something at the core of it that was keeping everything moving forward. Even though this track tries to finish in a more energetic way, I think the length of the intro and the way it brings everything down is too much of a pace killer, because we open on this 3-chord keyboard loop and sparse acoustic guitar accompaniment, which goes on for quite some time, with a couple of supersonic aircraft flyby sound effects to try and add something to it, but it doesn't do much to enliven the rather flat loop that we're dealing with. And the lyrics appear, and they're delivered in a rather drab, said rather than sung kind of way, which doesn't do anything to raise the interest for me. If anything, it gives me more to pick on, as the lyrics aren't great. The first line, "Although I look with clouded vision," feels 1 syllable too long, which as an opening gambit is already going to annoy me. And then the next line, "On a stormy atmosphere." The way the word atmosphere is elongated, I always expected to say on a stormy afternoon. Also, I feel like they mispronounced diminishing. I feel like they put an extra im into it. So after those 3 lines on the trot, there's not much that's going to save it going forward for me. And it pootles about for another 3 minutes. There's an introduction of a lead guitar that helps us a bit, but it's very far back in the mix. So it just kind of adds to the blurriness and the fuzziness rather than bringing clarity to the track. And to compound it, we have this "what lies in store for me" repeated line. And it gets more and more animated, and that sounds cool. But it is a small highlight of what is a pretty beige track for me. Also, the concept of will I ever discover what lies in store for me is a strange thing to ask, because if it lies in store for you, then you'll discover it eventually, right? That's how things being in store for you works. So I don't know if that's just impatience or if that's trying to be more profound than I think it is or something, but there's nothing here that's really going to even allow me to try to give it any wiggle room in terms of me liking it. It even ends in a lame way with the volume just falling off on the last note, like the band itself lost interest at the very end. I felt like there might have been potential here. This could have maybe been something if there'd have been a bit more effort or working on it or something, or maybe the band thinks this is really good. I don't know. But for me, this unfortunately is several leagues away from the previous 4 tracks, and it does feel like a pace killer for me and not one that I've ever really been able to even try and meet halfway.
Well, I don't think the band thinks it's really good, because from what I've read so far, the band doesn't think anything's really good on this record. I enjoy it more than you do, and more than they do, clearly. To me, this does sound quite like a Dave solo track. I can imagine this on a Dave Brock solo album, even without having all of the Dave Brock solo albums. And I quite like the folky element to it. And I think I listen to the sound of Dave's voice more than I listen to the actual lyrics, which makes the lyrics less annoying to me than they are to you, because it's more the sound of it that I think I'm connecting with. And now you're saying they did this, this, and this. I'm now thinking, yeah, that's pretty annoying, isn't it? But in the 10, 20, 30 times I've heard it leading up to this, those haven't really connected with me. So I quite enjoy this as a drop-in pace, and it continues the heavy, not heavy, heavy, not heavy sequence that actually is about to continue as well. You picked up on the ending, and I totally agree. The ending is horrible because all you need is 2 or 3 seconds to let it play out. But it speaks to a carelessness in the preparation of the album, which I think is what the band are referring to in the record company just putting it out before they were ready. It has that feel to it because there is no need and no excuse for that. I remember sending you something that I'd done once, and it had such a lot of reverb on it that it took many minutes for the note to die out. And I cut the track before the note had completely disappeared. And you picked up on it. And that's what this feels like to me. Just give it another couple of seconds, guys. I mean, we've already talked about it for 10 times longer than it takes to happen. But that's kind of the impact that it has. But on the whole, as a track, I quite like the bringing things down moment, the folky kind of feel to it, and Dave's singing. I referred earlier to the fact that Ron has 2 of these kind of punky tracks on the album, and that I preferred the second one. The second one is Reptoid Vision. And where do you stand on Reptoid Vision?
Yeah, it's a return to rock, isn't it? And I wrote a possible victory for Ron Tree in the Rock versus Sequencers battle that was maybe happening last time. And I know he was quoted in the book saying that he thought the band should go in a more Blue Skin direction. And this is as close to Blue Skin as this album is going to get. So he definitely got his chance to give it a try over multiple albums. It's funny how we go from Clouded Vision to Reptoid Vision. There's a lot of visions happening all in one place. It might have been better maybe to rename it or put it somewhere where the similarities aren't so obvious, but here we are. The content of the lyrics also sounds more Ron Tree-esque in that they make no sense. But I think they have something to do with aliens, I think. Sadly, this is another song that the lyric websites have forsaken, so I can only go with what I have been able to get. We open with a very short 1 bar that crashes right into the riff, and it's a much more simple riff compared to Alchemy, as it's designed to be sung or shouted over, but it's still quite catchy in its simplicity. It's altogether pacey and fun. I think that it's sonically got a good bed in which to operate on. The drums are a little weak again, but you can hear them driving the piece along. I guess that's just how they mix the drums. I always like a little bit more thump in my lower end, sonically at least. So with the platform for Ron fully set up, it's now time for him to come and do his thing. And I think fans of Ron will find this track more of what they like him for, with a fast delivery, with dynamic intonation, and a delivery ranging from almost nu metal rap to punky rasping sounds. But as someone who wasn't a fan of Blue Skin, I find the delivery a little lackluster. It has almost that Nathan Barley style to it again, a bit like The Secret Agent or something, with seemingly random lyrics. I hear turn gold into lead in a sort of reverse alchemic practice, which I'm sure would upset rather than impress people. There's a crack in the sky and atom brain cell in a nuclear mind, maybe. So I don't know. This for me smacks of someone who thinks that what they're saying is very clever, but I'm having trouble taking it on board and processing it in a way which I can get anything out of. It's not as profound or as illustrative as Hawkwind have sometimes done. It's much more of a stream of consciousness, so it doesn't grab me. But if someone told me they found it super profound and engaging, I wouldn't feel the need to tell them they're wrong or anything. That's just, how you take it. The track itself is made up of 3 verses with a little jam between verse 1 and 2 and a much longer breakdown between verse 2 and 3. The jam's pretty good and works with the internal logic of the track, so I'm down with that. I think the breakdown is too long and too sparse in content to really hold my interest when we get between verse 2 and 3, and I do find myself starting to wonder what's for tea, or who played the crazy guy who hijacks Mulder's car at the start of X-Files Season 6, which actually was a legitimate thing I wondered about, and if anyone's interested, it was Bryan Cranston. So the best thing to happen about this track was that I filled my X-Files trivia up a little bit. And, by the time we get to verse 3, I'm fine to have it happen, but it's not with a whole bunch of enthusiasm. And by the time the 7-minute track is done, I am very much done with it.
It's amazing to me that this track is 7 minutes, because to me it races along, and I've never been aware that it took that long. There are some tracks where the complete opposite is true, but this one feels like it races along. Although that may be because of the long breakdown in the middle, and I kind of think of this as being the bits either side. The thing I love with this is how the words sound. Reptoid vision, silicon eyes gives you an opportunity to massively ham it up when you sing it. And Ron massively hams it up, and I'm here for it. It's a line that I kind of wait for, and then Ron smashes it into the back of the net, and I'm like, yep, I'm looking forward to when Ron does that again. I've always thought it was something to do with, genetic engineering and aliens and human hybrids and blah. It's definitely a mishmash of lots of different alien-human conspiracy stuff, which, Alien 4 was. But yes, I dig the energy of this. It's another one where it's pretty clear what Ron is deliberately intent on bringing to the band. Whether they loved it or not, who knows? But I think it's an asset to have these tracks on the album. They really lift it into something different than it would otherwise have been. It would have been fun to hear these done live, because I kind of think that these being Ron tracks would have meant that Ron would have thrown himself into these with abandon, and they would have been a lot of fun. So yeah, Reptoid Vision is a fun track that I enjoy, and I like where they've put it on the album. And the last track on side 2 of the vinyl is Population Overload, which is a Dave Brock and Ron Tree collaboration.
And for a track with such a dark title, Population Overload is pretty light and chill in its overall vibe, I would say. I'd also say this track feels like 4 very separate ideas all squished together into one slightly random sonic journey, with a general sense of double electro groove running through the, again, 7-minute runtime to give a sense of cohesion, but it's a proper journey. It's another track that sounds like it could have been inspired by left field for me, with a big subby bass and offbeat ragga key stabs. It all sounds like something from Melt, which was another track on that album, which I'm going to keep bringing up. But again, not unwelcomely. Anyone who listens to something like that and says we should do something like that is definitely welcome, especially in the mid to late 90s. At the very beginning of this track, we have Idea 1, which is full of floaty, glassy synth pads that make it sound like the last nail spa at the end of the universe, which I think is really, really nice, actually. It's very quite relaxing and very glistening and glassy and nice. I like it a lot. And that goes on for just over a minute before we move on to Idea 2, which is this spoken word breakdown featuring Pensive Dave. And while the track is called Population Overload and the spoken piece is about a lot of people being in a tight crowd, I personally find it hard to extrapolate the story to a general feeling of population overload, as in there being too many people for the entire planet. The story feels more like it could be attributed to just trying to negotiate airport security or dealing with a crowd at a football match or something. I like the way the story is written and conveyed in general. The line causing me to move with my arms across my chest, a straight jacket suit, a concrete vest, gives me a very visceral description of what it's like to be in a huge crush of people when you feel totally pinned and the only way to fight it is to just stay upright until the mass of humanity ebbs and flows and you can get out of it. I've definitely been in a few of those situations myself in crowds. It can be very scary, so I'm not empathizing with it. But because it starts, I'd barely left my house, kind of sets up the idea that this place is totally overflowing with people. But for me, it could also just be the central line at 8 a.m. You know, I don't know why I choose to argue with this story to this degree, but I do. Maybe because the title is such an existentially triggering one, I was expecting something at a larger scale than someone who sounds like they accidentally wandered into Notting Hill Carnival or something. I know they then say that people tell them to march forward and they're like, are we in control of our lives and that kind of thing. So you can extrapolate it to a larger thing. It just doesn't quite take me there. But anyway, after the story's over, we get to possibly the most conventional idea, which is a nice electro dance number, which is probably the most conventional electro dance idea that Hawkwind have ever made. There's a clear, very danceable loop that you can sway your shoulders to. There's a very slappy snare beat on the 2 and the 4, which I like. It's got some really nice groove to it, and there's some strange SFX cacophony over the top, but it's all tamed by this unwavering bass and these offbeat keys that keep us locked in. And then we get this half-sung, half-rapped vocal. Again, I can only hear part of it due to the way it's mixed, but it definitely says the world's gone cockeyed, set to explode. And then it says something about DNA code, but after that it's so much snatched gibberish, which again, I don't know if it matters. I quite like it as a texture even if you can't quite tell what it is, but it's got this interesting idea to it. And then we have this pitter-patter drum breakdown, which goes on for maybe slightly too long for my tastes, but then we get this guitar riff that comes in with lots of bend and swagger to it, which works really nicely to introduce idea 4, which has this, again, offbeat keys and this drum slap, and we slowly peter out for an excruciatingly long time before dissolving into quite a heavenly little synth pad, which is not the same as the one we came in on, but has the same feeling to it. So, like Blue Skin from the last album, I quite enjoy the messiness of this track, and I know that you enjoyed Blue Skin for that messiness. If there was a radio edit of this, I would probably like it even more, but as an interesting cut and paste sonic experience, I do like it. This for me has a slightly kind of John Peel-y vibe to it. Like I could imagine this being played at midnight on a Wednesday to freak out some people on a radio and it doing quite well. This is going to sound really bad. It's not supposed to. It doesn't sound professional. The last track we just had was very much, we're a band, we put a track together, we are playing you music because we are musicians. This is almost back to Some People Never Die vibes. It could only have been produced in a studio by taking ideas and mixing them together and playing with them. You know, I don't think you could even do this one live, and if you did, it would probably be massively confusing. It's another very different offering that this album has. So overall, even though there are some bits which I'm slightly unsure about, I think I am a fan.
It's an interesting one. It took a while for me to focus on this one. It used to just kind of pass me by a bit and felt almost like it was filler. Now I don't think of it that way. Once I properly listened to it, I got into it a lot more. I quite like Dave's spoken word things. It's funny, we've both referred to things from Church of Hawkwind. And whenever Dave goes into like story mode, it reminds me of something like Fall of Earth City, that kind of vibe. So that part of the track I really like. When you get to Ron's bit later on, that little rap element of it, the line, the world's gone cockeyed, annoys me because of the word cockeyed. A different choice of word there, given that that's not the word upon which the rhyme is based, you could substitute something else in there. So that always leaps out at me and annoys me slightly. The rest of it I quite like. And what I do like when that is going on, the little guitar loop that happens is really quirky and fun and feels very Hawkwind. And reminds me a little bit of bits that they would drop in on the Sonic Attack version of Sonic Attack. So as I've started to pick out different bits and pieces that I like, the track has grown on me. And now I quite look forward to it. We get the second vinyl out of the double album. And track 1 on this vinyl is a collaboration between Jerry Richards and Ron Tree, the two new boys, and that is Wheels.
Another space rock jam to carry on the arrangement we've had since the beginning of the album. This one I keep thinking is an instrumental until we hit the breakdown. because the initial instrumentation is so big, it feels like there's no room for vocals at all, and indeed there isn't until we get to a more sparse breakdown. We open, to go back to the start of the track, on a deep, grungy synth bass with lots of square wave fuzz to it, and then very quickly a distorted guitar comes to join the party, and we gradually layer in some more guitar and synth instrumentation over the course of a minute or so, and we have a pretty intense wall of sound to bathe in. The melody itself is pretty basic, but has lots of animation in it, so you don't feel like you're missing out on anything. In fact, when there finally is a new chord in the piece, almost 2 minutes later, it almost comes as a surprise, because you've got so used to it doing what it's doing. When it does a little key change, you're like, wait, what? There's lots of synth rises, lots of high-pitched guitar wails, random blips and swishes that just keep the whole thing busy until we hit the breakdown, when the grunge bass comes back to the forefront and we get Lectury Dave coming in to give us a little sermon about oil in the world of the wheel. It's not a bad little spoken piece, and I like the line, the world of the wheel, because it's an interesting take on the classic idea of the wheel being a game-changing invention of progress, but here it's actually taken one step beyond that into mechanization, and therefore the pollution and geological turmoil that makes it turn, or what we need to do in order to make the wheels turn. But after the intensity of what's come before, I find it a little bit of a buzzkill, even though the idea is kind of profound, and especially because it takes us a long time to get going again. I like it as an idea, I don't quite vibe with the execution. The bass just about carries it by adding these little metallic clangs and whispered lines over the top of it to keep some interest. And at some point I swear Dave says, with my sandwich of steel, which if so is an amazing thing to say.
He says, my sandwich of steel and my thermos of oil.
Amazing. I love that. That's fantastic.
Yeah, absolutely.
Saying that over a bit which is a little bit too long when I'm just starting to lose interest doesn't help me take the track too seriously. But when we finally get back to the track, it's still as spirited and intricate as it always was. But I do feel like I'm missing something on its return. And I thought maybe it was just a long interruption, but if I jump between this part and the pre-breakdown part on my iTunes player play bar, there does feel like there is some tangible drop in intensity. And I haven't quite figured out what it is, but if I play it, skip the breakdown and keep playing it, there is a difference. So the ending is slightly disappointing for me. Overall, I'd say the first 3 minutes are pretty fun, but also this is something I feel I can get from other bands if that's what I want to listen to. So it's kind of weird to hear Hawkwind slum it in more basic rock when they're usually bringing us things like Alchemy if they're going to rock out to. It's possibly the deepest quote unquote idea that we're going to get with this idea of this world of oil, this world of the wheel, but it's not saying more than they've said before, and it's not saying it in a super amazing way, but it is at least there. So I guess nice to have for that reason, but I feel like this could do with a little bit of tightening, and then it could have been a pretty decent track. Right now it's okay.
So I love this track. When I was walking around New York and this starts up, I was instantly interested and wondering where it was going to go. It really, really lifts off when that opening riff, there's a key change and the secondary riff comes in. And that riff is like a euphoric moment for me. And it was like scoring a goal at Wembley. In my head, I was punching the air and going, yes, Hawkwind. I love that lift that carries it then into the spoken word. So you get a few minutes of the initial riff, and then you get a couple of minutes of the second riff with its incredible lift to it. And then the spoken word bit, there were some phrases in there that I really liked. There's a line about birds and ignoring their song. I can't remember exactly what the line is.
Deaf to its song, I think.
Yes, and I really like that. And then just when I'm starting to think I've slightly run out of patience with the spoken bit, the sandwich of steel and thermos of oil comes in, and I'm grinning again because it's kind of silly but brilliant. And then when it comes out of that, it kicks straight back in to the big euphoric riff, which then leads into a guitar solo, which is a proper full-on metal guitar solo. It has string bends and hammering. It has to be Jerry Richards, obviously, but I was definitely there for it and loved it. And in fact, on that first play of the album, when I was walking around listening to it, when this ended, I had to play it again and then again before I could go on to the following track. I was immediately slightly addicted to this track. And actually, for me, this is my favourite Hawkwind track of the 90s. Even today, as soon as it kicked in, I was like, yes, here we go. So yeah, it's funny because it is quite traditional in its sound. I like Jerry's guitar tone and the soloing that he does, but it's very different to the normal soundscape that Hawkwind bring, if you know what I mean. It is like putting a metal guitarist into Hawkwind. And to a certain degree, there's an element to this and this album. Do you remember how we felt with Levitation? We both really loved Levitation, but were pleased that that wasn't what the band was moving forward. And I kind of think that way with the guitar tones and things in this. I love the fact that this track exists, but I'm glad that it's not in an album full of tracks like this. So I absolutely adore this track and everything in it, but I totally hear what you're saying. But it's the highlight for me. And then we get a return to Hawaii and some sea sounds and Cowie, which is another Dave Brock song.
Yeah, an island in Hawaii. So we are still in Hawaii, Kauai Island.
Yep.
This feels like something from the cutting room floor of Population Overload. It's chill and floaty and has what sounds like synthetic flutes over the top, which is a rarity for Hawkwind. It has that Super Nintendo role-playing game vibes for me again, which we've had from them before. I can't remember when, but I remember it being fun that they did it. It's a nice short little thing surrounded by wave sounds, like we've wandered from one side of the island to the other, from the start of the track to the end. And it's just kind of nice, and I don't really have much more to say about it.
Yeah, it's got its big pads. It's very, very chill, which, let's face it, if you're talking about an island in Hawaii, is exactly what it's supposed to be. So it sets out to do something and absolutely does it. It's interesting that one of the articles talking about the album talks about it as being this electronic continuation. But actually, this is only the second time on the album that we've had this. And we get one more with Love in Space, but most of the album is not this. And I think if this were on Business of the Future or Electric TP or something, it would be rather lost in the middle of all the other tracks that kind of do this a bit. But on here, because we've had such a sprawling collection of different types of music, of genres, of sounds, and of inspirations, it fits quite well. And again, they've done another thing that they do throughout the album, which is of massive contrast from one track to the next. So Cowie works for me on that level. It's not one that I'll remember particularly, but it's also not one that I'd ever have any intention of skipping. It's that. Which leaves us to one that I probably do have intentions for skipping, which is Taxi for Max, that I don't really understand what it's doing here.
No, or why it exists ever, and why when it was made someone thought this belongs on an album.
Yeah.
Taxi for whoever is sometimes shouted when someone has done something stupid. I remember being shouted at university if someone dropped their pint or something, you know, oh, taxi for Alan. And I checked the sleeve notes and the back of the album and everywhere I could, but I couldn't find a Max anywhere, so I don't know who they're even talking about. The track itself is a largely random collection of what sounds like Foley room samples of breaking glass, smashed pianos, clangy metal, distorted whistling, and jittery synth wobbles. It has a throwback to the Starfighters or Good Evening or something when they were messing about, but I had hoped that they had grown past this, but clearly not as much as I thought they would. For me, it's a largely pointless 43 seconds and quite happy to delete it from my mind.
Yeah, they've done little 30, 40 second, 1 minute things on albums in the past, but when they've done that, it's always been a very short dip into some kind of atmosphere or loop that they just didn't develop into a track, which is not this. If this was the introduction to a track or the outro from a track, then I could tolerate it as being part of some bigger narrative. On its own, it's a bit bizarre. The final track of the original CD release of this album is a track that they play a lot, and actually it features quite a lot in Hawkwind history at this time, and that is Love in Space.
The studio version in brackets.
Yeah.
Because I was very surprised when I saw this name come up again, as it's on White Zone, and I loved it when it was on White Zone. But this studio version is so different, they may as well have called it something completely different. My first note before I realised the connection between the names was that this would have fitted really well onto White Zone, around the end of where their version of Love in Space is. So subconsciously I must have felt some kind of connection. But when you're actually listening to it, it's so different, I can't really draw a parallel. If anything, I thought that maybe we're picking up a little bit of what SpaceX was putting down at the end of the last album. Like, could this be the concluding half of the final chapter we were so agonizingly missing? But it's not quite that, but it might arguably be in the same general vicinity. I quite like this, honestly. It's very different, but it's undeniably groovy. The very start of the intro sounds like a cutting from Vega from Alien 4. In fact, I'm sure it is. The tone of the synth and the notes makes it sound like if it's not a clip from that album or a sample, then they've kept the same synth patch, which is totally fine. It's just interesting. And they move away from it almost instantly into this new sound, which is loungy and lo-fi, following on from that nail salon idea from before. Kind of cheesy, but a good cheesy. Like one of those tapes made on the cheap you get in saunas and spas, which has since formed a core element of that vaporwave sound decades on from where we are listening to this album. So again, this is almost proto-vaporwave in a way. The keys are simple but characterful, reminding me a little bit of the Cold War Kid or something in terms of its arrangement and the way it works. And the bass is deep and subby, again, very contemporary, again, following that Afro house vibe they've had throughout this album. There's a squelchy 303 style acid line, Roland's failed bass accompaniment synth, which became an instant flop, but then was found to make quite interesting sounds by techno producers. So they actually using the instruments of techno in this. And that's adding just some extra texture and keeping it feeling contemporary without actually overloading the sound. Because if you listen to techno tracks of the 90s, if you have an 808 drum machine and a 303, you basically can make techno. But this is very well integrated into the mix, so it's adding this contemporary sound without it taking over, but it places it very firmly in the 90s for me. The percussion is light, also again kind of cheesy, but good cheesy. It's not getting in the way of the instrumentation, which is definitely the thing driving the whole thing over the rhythm section, but the rhythm section is fun to have. And this track is just fun, but we listen like we're in on the joke. It's very easy to get absorbed into it because it's just very confident, a little bit like the end of White Zone for me. You know, there's not that much going on musically, but it's heavily looped. All the loops are fun, so you can vibe with it. There are these incidental sounds and the occasional key change to keep things interesting. It's like being on hold while you're trying to contact a beneficent cosmic deity about filing a claim on your Starship insurance or something. You know, it's we even end back with a little Vega tease, which I enjoyed from the last album, as a little cherry on top. So it's just smile music, this. And for the album to have everything in it and then end on this, it's bizarre in the most glorious way. So all in all, I would say I like everything except the title on this track.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's interesting, in fact, because you point out how different this is from the White Zone version. Wikipedia credits Love in Space on White Zone to Alan Davey. This is credited here to Dave Brock. So you almost wonder if these are two different tracks just sharing the same title, which happens, I guess. Yeah, I totally agree with everything you've said. This is a smiley way to end the album. Loungy is what I put. I'd forgotten about Vaporwave. It's a good call. Even though it's loungy and it has that vaporwave feel to it, it still manages to be quirky and upbeat at the same time. And we will encounter Love in Space again in the future. Not on a studio album, but it's part of Hawkwind history for a little while. So yeah, it's a nice one. And I think the right note to end on, I am happier that they didn't end on one of the rocky tracks. This is a good way to feel your way out of the record. So that would be the end of the original CD release. But as everyone will be aware, I didn't have the original CD release and was completely unaware of its existence. When I caught up on this, I bought the double vinyl, and side 4 of that is made up of 3 bonus tracks. And I'm not used to the bonus tracks being on the vinyl. I'm used to people putting more and more tracks on the CDs and having to settle for less on the vinyl than you would usually get. So in my head, Distant Horizons contains these 3 tracks. Usually what I would do is say to Matt, the album ends here, so that Matt doesn't then listen to all of the offcuts, alternate takes, snippets and whatever that come after it. And this time I did say that the last track was Love in Space. But then we chatted a bit, having had a few plays of the album, and we decided to include the bonus tracks in our chat about the album rather than what we would normally do, which is leave the bonus tracks off, and then when we come back to do like a summary of the decade in our decade recap, we have a section where we talk about orphan tracks that didn't make it onto the album, and we pick our favorite ones and we do a playlist of them. But most of the time, those tracks are unfinished, alternate takes, live versions, B-sides or whatever. But these aren't, with the exception of one, which is the alternate take of Cowie. There are 2 tracks on it, which are just completely finished, polished tracks that for me, every time I listen to the album, I think, why on earth were these not on the album? So we are going to cover those here rather than in our end of decade wrap up because they bear that conversation at this point. And there's an interesting bit in Ian's book, Sonic Assassins, and that earlier little bit about Richard Chadwick talking about Jerry Richards' involvement in the album is also from Ian's book. And this is Jerry Richards talking at the point when Cherry Red released the vinyl. He says, I did notice when Cherry Red were kind enough to send me the updated copy that it has a couple of extra tracks on it, which were recorded around about the same time. I don't think they were part of the Distant Horizon sessions per se, but they recorded around about the same time. He goes on to say, in my mind, 2 tracks, Morpheus and Archaic, are actually the best 2 tracks on the re-release, yet they never made it on to the original. Now, here we are in 2014 talking about an album from 1997, and in retrospect, and with glorious hindsight we've got now, listening to these 2 numbers, you would say, wow, this is fantastic. Listen to this playing. It's very psychedelic, crawling, screaming, acid rock from this crazy old band Hawkwind. And it's a new direction that Ron and I, and Richard to a larger degree, were keen to push. So clearly there's a little bit of love for these tracks, at least from Jerry. And the first of these, Matt, is Archaic.
I feel like this is a solid rock standard again. It's nice that it comes after Love in Space in terms of the rock chill thing that we have. And it's built around a very simple 3-chord riff, up a tone, down 2 tones, return to main tone. Pretty good crowd work track for the 7 minutes that it exists. The lyrics are atonally shouted over the track. The lyrics are once again not available, but in the chorus, I'm pretty sure they say deploy the steed, which I wondered if that was like a Magnu reference, the hawk horse of choice who rears his golden mane from time to time, which would be nice if it was as a incantation or battle cry or something. I'm not super sure, but yeah, it sounds cool. If it was higher up in the playlist, I would be struggling to find too much to say about it. It's got energy, but it's somehow equally energetic and a little uninspired at the same time. I can imagine live it being fun. I can imagine, people throwing themselves around to it a bit. But at the same time, because the melody itself is quite basic and I can't quite hear what's being said, I don't know quite how to get myself into this beyond just listening to it and going, yeah, seems a decent rock standard. I actually think the last 30 seconds are the most interesting. We dip into half time with much more attitude in the bass and the noodling from a lead guitar over this noise, which is somewhere between an echoey shout and an air raid siren. And I really like that. And I keep thinking it's going to build to something finally, but then it's all over. So I do find that also frustrating. So, for me, overall, it's atmospheric and interesting and groovy, but I'd love this track to have been more of the last 30 seconds. For me, it makes sense as a bonus track. I wouldn't swap it for anything else that's come before if we had to only have 11 tracks. Yeah. I enjoy this. I enjoy particularly the second half of it. The first half, to your point, is a kind of regulation rock track, a pretty heavy rock track. Hawkwind are very rarely this heavy. And again, in my mind, puts Jerry Richards all over it. It may not be, and anybody is free to correct me, but it's what's in my head about the heavier elements of this. The second half, when you start having the shouted archaic stuff, I love that. And the first part of the track builds up to that to me. I quite like the delivery in the chorus in the first half. But as you say, the riff is a fairly standard hard rock progression. But it becomes far more energetic in the second half with those kind of shouted vocals. And I quite like the fact that both Dave and Ron seem to be contributing vocals to this because there's a nice contrast in the voices there. So I really enjoy this, and I'm glad it's that way round because it's really disappointing when you love the first half of a track and then it kind of goes off. A bit like Alchemy, it's one of those tracks that I could imagine as a B-side or as a brilliant bonus track or as something that may or may not make the album. So ironically, being a bonus track that has found its way onto the album is kind of its perfect position. So yes, I'm really happy with it. The next one we get is the alternate take of Cowie. There's one track on this album which name I have trouble pronouncing, and they've decided to put it on twice, which feels personal. And this is a little different. Yeah, I mean, to call this an alternate take and put it as a extra track makes perfect sense. This is normally what I like when you get extra tracks. It's almost like DVD extras back in the DVD age, when sometimes you'd see, oh, the director tried this, or this made it onto the cutting room floor because it didn't test well or whatever, and you can start to see, you know, alternative endings and alternative scenes and things. This is a alternative take of Kawaii is interesting to know. So it's more like a tidbit of information. And we know this is going to be alternative quite quickly, as the previously beatless Kawaii is turned into a rhythmic tribal freakout with layers of tin and skin drums creating this thick and intense groove for a minute before they resolve into the OG floating pads and synthetic wind instruments. You can argue that this isn't an alternate track so much as it's the same track with a minute cut off the end and a minute of drumming stuck on the beginning. Usually alternate would suggest maybe a deeper reimagining of the track, like what happened to Love in Space, although maybe that's way too reimagined. So somewhere between Kawaii and Love in Space, that's where alternates should exist. I think we'd all agree with the band in terms of what they put on the album, that the track is nicer without the drumming. I feel like maybe they could have saved that drumming for another track or idea rather than necessarily putting it as an alternative track. But considering this was re-released, maybe they just thought, well, these drums are worth sharing with the world. I don't know whether or not they do anything with it because I'm obviously stuck in 1997. But if they don't, then I'm glad to hear that they did it because it's cool to hear. It's just an odd track to attach them to.
Yes, you wonder whether they created both versions of the track and then chose one for the record, which would make sense to me, rather than post-recording put the drums in there, because actually, as you'd say, you'd actually be better off creating something different that isn't an alternate take of anything. I do like hearing it, though. It's one of the better alternate takes. Usually when I hear alternate takes of tracks, whichever band I'm listening to, I've become so used to the canon version of the track that the alternate version of the track is never more than interesting. In this case, I wasn't so embedded with the canon version of the track. I've heard it the same number of times I've heard the alternate take. Mm-hmm. So perhaps I'm slightly more open to receiving the alternate take. I do, to your point, prefer the original and think that the original, I say, that the one that's on the album proper, mainly because of how it fits in with the other tracks. Its contrast to Wheels would not be as impactful if it was the alternate take with the drums on it. And maybe in sequencing the album, that was where the decision came from, who knows. But I can certainly listen to it and not think that I need to skip, which is what I would usually do with an alternate take of a track that I've heard already 3 or 4 songs previously. And then the final track is the other one that Jerry referred to that he likes very much, which is Morpheus.
I'm not sure I can emphasize how much I disagree with Jerry. It's got a strong percussive intro, so I'll give it that. But then it resolves into one of the most annoying things Hawkwind have ever made. For me, it sounds like every member of the band is in their own room playing a different track at the same time. This also might be the worst example of Hawkwind putting in too many words into lines than they've ever done. This is worse than Powers of Sorcery to the Test. This is worse than Only Release When the Torture Comes When I'm Asleep. This is all over the place, all the time. And before we even get to the lyrics, we open on this very big, very intricate drum beat, which actually reminds me of Reach Up by Perfecto All-Stars, if anyone remembers that slab of 90s dance floor cheesiness, which doesn't really set anything up for a huge amount of success. But it's groovy enough for 8 bars of this. Then there's a strange sound at the end of every loop, which sounds like some light industrial tool, which keeps the loop moving forward. And I think, okay, well, maybe they're trying to do something with this. Then the loop drops down, so there's these little knocks and stuff, and it's as block party as Hawkwind has ever got, which always makes me think that they might be going to something interesting. But then with no real ceremony at all, the band come in, and the first time they did, I had to check that I hadn't accidentally started playing something else in another tab. I was like, this can't be what I am hearing. There are what sounds like 2 separate guitars, or 1 guitar and some other stringed instrument like a sitar or something, and the vocals are all doing their own thing in terms of timing and rhythm, and as far as I can tell, key. The drums slowly give up, which actually helps because then it's harder to hear if they're going completely off beat or not anymore, because it sounded like they were. And the whole thing dissolves into this multi-layered cacophony, which reminds me of some of the more experimental Beatles offerings from the latter half of their career, but nowhere near as accomplished, so it just becomes a huge mess. And about a minute in, it feels like it's trying to pull itself together, and we have this more sporadic drumming and a glassy synth twinkling its way through a simple 4-note arpeggio that's kind of nice. And then shortly after, we switch out for this twangy bass and vocal part, which slams the coffin lid shut on this track for me. Because, as I've said, the lyrics are completely bizarre. We get examples like dive into waters that lie inside, which doesn't fit. And then the words lie and in from inside become lion, which almost sounds like lion, but like it's stretched and weird, and they're having to contort themselves into their own time signature, which just messes up the delivery and completely throws off the rhythm. And then we have a few more lines with too many lyrics for one bar. And then we try and save it with this lively rock jam for a minute, which sounds fine, but then the plug's pulled on that and we crash into deafening silence with nothing else on the record to save us from it. It's the album equivalent of the ending of Monty Python and the Holy Grail when the police come and break up the siege on the castle, or like in Cloverfield where they just get blown up, and you know they're going to get blown up because it's found footage, but it doesn't make it any less satisfying. It's just too abrupt to enjoy, and it feels like a huge rug pull, and it just leaves the ending of the album not even anticlimactical. It's worse than an anticlimax. It's just nothing. Even that live track where they did a scratch cut and blew up their song, at least it signals the destruction in a way we can understand sonically and narratively. This just sounds like someone accidentally kicked the power lead for the recorder out of the wall while doing a frantic solo. I know the track is called Morpheus, and it definitely morphs around a lot. For me, it's morphing 4 tracks into one inexpertly, so I guess you could say it delivers on its promise, but there are better ways to morph through things. This feels like all the courses of a restaurant's tasty menu piled all together on one plate, dessert and all, and possibly the wine pairing as well, and just kind of shoved at us. And before we can even take a bite, it's removed from our table, and we're just left kind of staring into space going, well, that happened, and I really, really hope it never happens to anyone ever again. So Morpheus, kids, not even once.
Yeah, it's going to be hard to beat that. I'll keep this very, very brief. Morpheus is a massive mess, but I quite enjoy it. I'm just going to leave it there because I think that's the perfect counterpoint. So that is the music of Distant Horizons. And we come to the album artwork for Distant Horizons. An interesting thing here, Matt, is that at the beginning of the decade, you asked me what the kind of themes were that we would draw upon. And we kind of workshopped what those graphics were to end up with the Easter Island heads and that kind of mythical stone thing. You can see that this was actually quite an inspiration for it, even though there are definitely themes from all the albums. So that's an intriguing thing to come back to. Dave Brock, in one of the books, said that they called it the Tombstone album, and that Doug Smith, who's the manager, did the front cover in paint shop. So yes, that's the cover. Matt, what do you make of it?
Yeah, it's a rather drastic departure from the previous covers of the 90s. We've lost our painter, and to lose our painter and come to paint shop is not a really desirable way forward, I don't think. I actually wrote this has a very early Photoshop vibe to it, so I was wondering if that's correct, because you can get this effect in one click these days by using the emboss filter, and I don't know if it was harder or more impressive to do back then, or whether or not in 97 you still could do that. There's a definite early desktop digital art app vibe to this, which unfortunately hasn't aged particularly well. And I don't know if it looked amazing even back then. It's hard to remember. I guess it's closer to White Zone than anything else we've seen, but it's nowhere near as good as White Zone. And incidentally, actually, Angry Saints mentioned that White Zone was possibly done by Waldo Design and Dream Emporium. And this is Phil Smee, who did actually the Motorhead War Pig logo. So not sure if he did that one, but that seems to be the collective feelings of who might have done it. Maybe I think it's a bit similar because it shares a similar kind of palette in terms of a black and whitey kind of high contrast thing, but this one has this sort of lunar surface sandstone kind of vibe to it as well. It feels maybe a mix of Egyptian carving and Rosetta Stone mixed with the lunar surface. Initially, I thought the image in the middle was a scarab beetle or something, but then I thought that maybe, in fact, it's the double-headed hawk, but like highly eroded, because the head on the left looks quite hawky, and the one on the right is super messy. But I think maybe I could see a hawk head in there if I squint and use my imagination and the understanding of the band's logo But what surrounds what might be a hawk is what I originally thought was just a bunch of weird wiggly lines is actually a woman lying prostrate on the ground while her hands and legs are in the air and kind of bending around to make this squared off U shape at the bottom of the cover. I thought the wiggly lines at the bottom might have been the sea, but I think actually it's her hair to give her more of a feminine look. And below her is the album name in a sort of Celtic font and in a colour just a shade lighter than the dust of the main cover. And above it all is the Hawkwind logo in a new font. And like the rest of the artwork, the font is extruded in this dusty grey colour. And the W's are smaller, like when you add the TH or an ND after a number. And the K of the Hawkwind is also broken into a few pieces like a dropped plate, carrying on this idea that the whole thing might be an exhumed ancient tablet from a civilization long past or something. The font for the album looks kind of Celtic, and the colour of it pops a lot more than the Hawkwind logo, so I guess that draws the most attention. Honestly, the whole thing is a bit of a mess for me. There's not any real sense of placement for any of the elements. The hawk scarab thing is annoyingly off-center. The body and the text are all the way out to the edges, so they all look squished and uncomfortable, like they're kind of trapped in a box rather than living in any kind of space. The overall colour of the album is rather bland and unstimulating. I wouldn't see it standing out against the other albums you mentioned this year. Like, you know, you compare this to something like Fat of the Land, which has that crazy crab, and then you'd see this. This does look a little bit school project to me. Overall, what's in the album, what the album is made of sonically, deserved a better cover. I think the overall cover is uninspired, sadly.
Yeah, that's the word. And well done for actually finding that much to say. A round of applause. You did very well. The funny thing is that the concept, if someone came to me and said the cover of the next Hawkwind album, it's going to look like some unearthed tablet, my mind would start racing and I'd be thinking, oh, this is going to be rad. I love that idea. Do you know what I mean? The idea Hawkwind have been there and it's this mythology and the rest of it. But the implementation of it is rather sad and two-dimensional, given the fact that they've tried to make it look three-dimensional. It kind of isn't. It just all seems rather flat. And as you say, uninspired. And Distant Horizons, the album title, as you said, the colour pops out a little bit more. Doesn't look like it's part of the picture that the other stuff is. The Hawkwind logo, however it is, does look as if it's of the same piece with the edifice that sits beneath it. The Distant Horizons logo doesn't look like it's anything to do with the stuff above it. It doesn't look aged in any way. So it feels actually like a missed opportunity because I quite like the idea. I just really don't think much of the execution. And I think going back to when I wasn't aware that this was released, but then kind of saw bits of it appearing, like in the early 2000s on things like Audio Galaxy and whatever, part of what made me not realise that this actually was a Hawkwind Canon Studio album is this cover, because it doesn't look like a Hawkwind album in that respect. So yeah, it's a little bit of a shame. Funny that it's influenced our logo, but egos aside, I prefer our logo.
It's also a name for an album which feels like it's got so much going for it. Distant Horizons. It feels like you should be able to do something nice with it. And I might have to read this book a little bit to get some ideas, but Hawkwind very rarely have covers which make it look like they just gave it to the album exec and just went, figure it out. This almost looks bootleggy. Considering what we've just had, we've had this triptych of bespoke paintings. Whether you like them or not, you can't say that there wasn't genuine effort in those and an attempt to try and create something that fitted with the music in some way, where this doesn't really do that at all.
Exactly. The back just continues the very aged wall effect, but then just has the album information printed on it. There's no other interesting elements that are thrown in.
No, I found a couple of versions. The CD has what looks like almost a cell under a microscope in that splatty, extruded style.
Yeah.
And the vinyl seems to have what looks like a grasshopper or something on it.
Oh, yes, I see what you're saying. Now you point it out.
Yeah. Again, I don't know why, unless that's kind of Reptoid eyes or something, but I can't listen to this album and think, oh yeah, that's where they got the grasshopper from.
Although it is better than the back of the original CD, which is frankly awful.
Yeah, worse than Alien 4, which I'm almost impressed with.
Yeah. Well, at least Alien 4 had something on it. This is just a
lurid mustard yellow
with a smudge.
Yeah, and a font which makes it look like it's a garage band. It doesn't look like you would want to spend money on this album if you didn't know who Hawkwind were.
Yeah, the best piece of design on that's the barcode. And then we get what I have, which is the double vinyl. When you look at the gatefold inner, there's quite a nice photo of the band on the right-hand side that makes them look an awful lot happier than they actually sound when they talk about the album. They look like they're having a good old time, which, you know, maybe occasionally they did every now and again. And on the left, kind of an article that I'm guessing none of this was present in the original release. I think we had this with my version of Electric Teepee. There was a big article that had been put on the inner gatefold that wasn't present in the original release. So I think this has been put together specifically for the re-release, and it definitely makes the album sound much more important than anything else ever written about this album.
You actually sent me a high definition picture because I couldn't find it anywhere. It's by Malcolm Dome and it's written 14 years after the initial release. And actually the writer does seem to admonish society for sleeping on the album and Hawkwind in the 90s in general. Yeah. Which I think is an interesting choice given the fact that whoever's reading this actually bought the album.
Yes, that's very true. Particularly on the inner. If it was on the outside, then you could imagine picking up in the record shop and going, oh, I better buy this then.
Exactly. A big sticker on the front being like, buy this or you're an idiot. Malcolm Dome.
Exactly. And Malcolm Dome is, you know, he passed away relatively recently, revered rock writer. And I think I'm correct in saying that he wrote the book that came with the box set of Warrior on the Edge of Time. And to be fair, I would say we may not be glowing as Malcolm, but I do feel that we have been a lot more positive about this album than everything that I've read in the lead up. So, yeah, I think the designer of the album cover was also sleeping on Hawkwind in the 90s, which is a bit of a shame. And it might have been more interesting to see what Alan Arthurs could do. We'll never know. So that is the album artwork. And that is the complete package of Hawkwind's Distant Horizons, a very interesting exploration. For me, this was almost as new to me as it was to you. Probably the most unknown Hawkwind album that we will cover in the whole canon. I was largely aware, even if I wasn't a fan of some of them, and I was well into a lot of others. But one's kind of appearing as almost a mystery Lost Hawkwind album, which this kind of feels like, given how everybody seems to feel about it. So we go into our concluding thoughts and wrap up. And one thing, of course, we like to do is use the litmus test that is the Hawkwind Fans Worldwide Facebook Top 40 Albums by Elric Newby. And would you like to guess where in the top 40 this album falls, Matt?
41.
Very close. Very close. Outside. It is not named at all. It doesn't make it into the top 40.
Oof.
Which means it doesn't matter how many compilations and live albums there are, it doesn't make it in. There are some separate lists that Elric has put in. He's ranked the 70s albums and the 80s albums and whatever, just from the votes that he got. And of the 6 albums released in the 90s, this one comes in at number 6, below White Zone. So really not an awful lot of positivity. I said that I wanted to come back to Ian's book, Hawkwind Sonic Assassins, because he has quite an interesting conclusion. He's not exactly a fan of the album, but there's an interesting way to look at the album that Ian has. And he says this: in some ways, Distant Horizons was astounding sounds, amazing music for the 90s. A twist away from what had been done before, shocking its listeners in its radical overhaul of what the band were doing. And like Astounding Sounds before it, it seems a democratic record with writing credit opportunities shared around the band and a genuine meshing of different ideas and textures, even though there is no amount of time that could pass which could rehabilitate it in quite the manner to which Astounding Sounds has improved its legacy with age. So maybe an apology for rather than a flag waving from Ian. So that's quite considered. And to say there's more in Ian's book about this than there is anywhere else. What would your concluding thought be about Distant Horizons, Matt?
The idea of it being an Astounding Sounds-esque album is one that escaped me a little bit, but like I have said, it does feel a bit like an interesting scrapbook of a band which is maybe regrouping a little after clearly a bit of a fraught experience among themselves for what Alien 4 was going to be. Maybe this time this was a fraught experience, not necessarily between the band, but maybe with management and expectations and things, and maybe between themselves as well. I don't know. That doesn't feel as apparent. This feels much more Hawkwind laying out everything that they can do and proving that they can nail every single one of them, at least to a respectable degree. There's no searing highs in this album. If you ignore the bonus tracks, there's no huge lows. So you could argue that Alien 4 has better tracks, but I would say this overall is a better album in terms of me listening all the way through it. I'm definitely left feeling more buoyant and enjoying it over actually cherry picking tracks from Alien 4, which generally are more interesting tracks in their own right, if you see what I mean. If we finish the album at Love in Space, it's a really fun album with a lot of variety and sonic accomplishment. If you include the bonus tracks, it's a nice album that outstays its welcome probably by about 2 songs. As the album did originally finish with Love in Space, I delete the bonus tracks from my mind and my digital playlist, and I have the best album they've done since Electric TP, in my opinion. Certainly this album takes some of the experimental electro stuff from White Zone and the neo-space rock ideas from It Is the Business of the Future to Be Dangerous and blends it in a much more satisfying way than they did with Alien 4. That's how I see the genesis of this album, and it works for me because it's more what I am interested in. Maybe it's too synthy and experimental in that way for some of the more space rock purists, and in a way, if you take their more synthy experimentations and layer it up against people who are at the front of just doing that, you know, the synth purists, the Left Fields, the Chemical Brothers, all that kind of stuff, then this isn't going to compare. So they're kind of in a little bit of a difficult situation, but I feel by folding back into themselves, they still create an album which feels very them and still has a nice purity and internal logic to it that you don't need to compare it to other people for. I think you can still enjoy it. I think it's possibly more consistent than Electric TP, but it's not as good as Electric TP overall as well in terms of highs. Distant Horizons has no real think piece or super absorbing story, and not just because none of the lyrics I can find. I think in general that's something that's true, but it also proves it doesn't necessarily need it in order to give you a good time. I'd say this might be because of the current band setup, but we still have Chadwick and Brock who have made things like Mask of Mourning and Festivals previously. So I don't think it's the lack of band members to not do the stories, you know? But this is the first time I've said that Hawkwind have made a strong album without a big story highlight. So it's not mandatory for them to do so. It's just nice when they do. So I think overall for me, it's a very listen-toable album with a more contemporary electronic influence and a good title track, which is not always guaranteed. I, on the whole, have enjoyed this. I'll be interested to see what happens next, as always. And if you are listening to this, lovely listener, I always look at our analytics, and some of the albums which are not seen as hits definitely get listened to less. Maybe because people who like Hawkwind like to listen to the tracks and albums they're aware of, and not everyone wants to listen to us talk about an album which clearly has fallen out of the band and public consciousness a little bit. But if you have listened all the way to the end, thank you very much. I hope that you are able to maybe re-listen and see that there are some positives to be had if maybe it was dropped during a fractious time, or it's clearly rubbing shoulders with albums that were clearly liked a lot and still are. I hope you have enjoyed us talking about it, and thanks for coming with us on, again, a very long podcast. But I think on the whole, I'm leaving this with a general positive vibe, if maybe wishing a few things were a little bit better. It's way better than Infinity in terms of the final score that the album got.
I've very much enjoyed the listening experience with this album. That may well be because I've struggled a bit with the last couple, but I've enjoyed this, I think, because of the lift. I wonder if I listened to this album in a different sequence after a year of listening to different albums, whether I would be as upbeat about it as I am. But I am really happy that we've listened to this. I was happy with it the first time I played it, and playing it this morning, I was happy again. And I think objectively, Electric TP is a better album. Space Bandits, weirdly, although it's the first album of the 90s, it feels much more to me like the last album of the 80s. It feels like the follow-up to Xenon Codex, and then they changed direction entirely with Electric TP, and Electric TP defines the direction of the 90s. But Space Bandits for me would probably be my favourite 90s album. But I would say this would come under Electric TP and above the others for me. And I certainly wouldn't have had it outside of the top 40 entirely. There's stuff on it that I love the fact that it exists, and I'm glad it didn't turn into a direction that they went down. They did it once, did it really well, and then didn't continue it, and I'm very happy for that. So yeah, it's a really interesting one. I'm hoping that us doing this will bring some people who quite like it out of the woodwork, because I really haven't read any, I'm really looking forward to this one, notes. I've heard a lot more, good luck kind of notes. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see whether we are complete outliers, maybe like Malcolm, or whether there are a few fans of this one out there. We shall see. Now, before, Matt, we get to your picks for the various playlists, I would just like to do two things. One, I haven't done this for a little while, but if you have managed to get this far, then you are truly a dedicated listener. And as such, it would be amazing if on whatever platform you're on, you could spare a minute or so to give us some stars, preferably 5. And maybe a little review. It does help us with the algorithm. Whenever we do this, 1 or 2 people go in and do it, and we do get a little lift. It does make a difference. I remember Ian, when he was a guest on our show, saying that he sold a few more books when he was on, which is rather nice. So it would be nice if anyone could just give us a bit of review, a few stars. We would really appreciate it. And then secondly, we have merch that we have taken a very, very deliberate stance against making any money from. Because all of the Hawkbinge proceeds, all of the money that comes our way from the merch is donated to the British Bee charity, which is one that we believe in, we think the band would believe in, and hopefully all the fans of the band and people who would like the culture of the band would go with that. So if you were to buy one of our little boutique collection of Hawkbinge shirts, which are on skull print, the bees will thank you, and we will be happy also. And hopefully you'll have a nice Hawkbinge t-shirt as well. So, Matt, we need a track from Distant Horizons for the Hawkbinge master playlist.
It's going to be Love in Space. I think Love in Space became the sessions pick for White Zone. So for it to completely go away, transform itself, come back in a completely different guise, and just be such a surprising, groovy number, I can't not let that go documented. It wasn't an easy pick, but when we get to what I call the end of the album, if I end on this track, it's just such a singular experience that I feel like it has to be put into the playlist, if not for anything, just to categorize the band when clearly everything clicks into place and they experiment in a way which almost defines a genre of music which doesn't appear for another 25 years, which is pretty impressive.
Nice. And what will join Love in Space on the Hawkbinge Sessions playlist alongside all those turntable picks that we came up with at the top of the show?
I'm going to have a little conversation with you about this, Andy, because you're new-ish to this album as well. I have 2. It's either Wheels or Fentimine Street. And I personally lean towards Fentimine Street because it's, for me, a tip of the hat to Ron Tree politically, which I feel like would be nice. It's a weird little story. I think it's played with aplomb. I think it's one of the tracks which doesn't feel as long as it is. It comes storming out of the gates in track 2. It's capturing some of that punky spirit, which we've not had from Hawkwind for a while. So for me, it's nice for archival purposes as well. However, I also still like Wheels. I don't like it as much as you do, but at the same time, the Sessions playlist has become more something which isn't just me, it's us. So if you really, really like Wheels and would like that to be documented, I will give up Fentimine Street for Wheels.
I think if I hadn't quite so passionately described my love for Wheels, you would have gone with Fentimine Street and not really thought about it.
No, it's not true. I literally have 2 things written down on my notes.
You have Wheels written down anyway?
Yes.
Okay, that's interesting. I'm very happy with Fentimine Street being in there. I had kind of thought that perhaps my love for Wheels was very singular to me. It is my favourite track of the 90s. But I'm very happy with both because actually I think Fentimine Street is more important to the album than Wheels is. You could have swapped out Archaic for Wheels and it would fit in the context of the album. But Fentimine Street is such a manifesto track. It's such a, we're doing this now, and we haven't done this for a very long time. And it is Ron authentically doing Ron. So I'm very happy for it to be Fentimine Street.
Fentimine Street it is.
Excellent. That wraps us up. We will be at the Barbican for the Hawkwind tour stop there in support of their new album that comes out fairly soon. If you hear this and it hasn't happened yet, then hopefully we'll see you there. And if you hear this and the gig was 3 months ago, then we hope we saw you there and had a good time. And we're pretty excited also about the announcement of the Quiet Nights with Hawkwind electronic jamming. And so Hawkwind, the fact that they've done that because they filled in as their own support band when the support band couldn't make it, dabbled around a bit and quite enjoyed themselves, and so are now doing that. So I'm hoping to go to one of those if we can make it. So maybe we will see you at a Hawkwind or Hawkwind related show. Other than that, we will be attempting not to leave it quite so long. No promises, because life is our chaos. But we look forward to being back in your area next time. Technicians of Spaceship Earth, you have been listening to Hawkbinge, the Hawkwind podcast. It was devised and presented by Andy Hood and Matt Longstaff. The soundtrack was produced by Dissonant. To contact the show, drop us a message on Facebook, Instagram, or X, the artist formerly known as Twitter, by searching @Hawkbinge, or send an email to podcast@hawkbinge.space. Hawkbinge is a proud member of the Deep Dive Podcast Network. To find more great band and music-focused podcasts like this one, head to @DeepDivePodNet on Twitter and dive in. Thank you as always for listening. We'll see you next time.